Come, settle in now, and let the day release you. If you have found your way here, to this quiet voice and this slow, unhurried story, then you already know something about the particular longing that arrives at night. That wish for somewhere else to rest your mind, somewhere far away and long ago, somewhere the ordinary noise of your own life cannot follow. These stories will be here for you, night after night, whenever you need them. And if you would like to find your way back easily, there is a gentle kindness you can do yourself by subscribing, so that the next chapter is always waiting, like a lamp left on in a window. And before we begin, if you feel moved to leave a word in the comments, just where in the world you are listening from tonight, nothing more than that, you would be joining a quiet and scattered community of people doing exactly what you are doing right now, in their own darkness, in their own beds, in cities and villages and somewhere in between, all across the globe. It is a small and tender thing to know that others are listening too. But now, let us go somewhere. Let us go a very long way back. Close your eyes if they are not already closed, and let the world around you soften and recede. And imagine the light of late afternoon falling across 7 hills, in a city that has stood for centuries and believes, with some justification, that it will stand for centuries more. This is Rome, and it is evening, and the sun is doing what the sun always does over that particular stretch of the Tiber Valley. It is thickening to amber, deepening to the color of old honey, catching the smoke that rises from 10,000 cooking fires across the hills and the valleys between them, so that the whole city seems for a moment to be suspended in something golden and warm and ancient, as though the air itself remembers every hour that has ever passed through it. The hills themselves are the first thing to understand, because they are not dramatic peaks or sharp ridges, but something gentler and more particular than that. They are swellings in the earth, comfortable and round-shouldered, rising from the floodplain of the Tiber like the slow breathing of the ground beneath the city. And the city has climbed over every one of them and down into the valleys between them, so that walking through Rome is an experience of constant, gradual change, the ground always tilting slightly one way or another, the streets always curving to follow some contour that was old before the first stone was laid. The Palatine is where we linger first, because it is here, on this particular hill, that the story we are tracing through these long nights will have its center of gravity. Not yet, not tonight, but soon. For now it is simply a hill in the amber light. Its upper terrace is crowded with the large and comfortable houses of old families. Houses that have been added to and altered for generations. Their courtyards open to the sky. Their walls a worn terracotta deepened by decades of sun. Their gardens giving off the quiet resinous scent of boxwood and bay laurel in the cooling air of the evening. Below the Palatine, the Forum is beginning to empty. It has been a long day down there in that flat space between the hills, as it always is, as it always has been, a day of business and argument and petition and gossip and the slow grinding machinery of Roman public life. Men in togas moving from one portico to another, slaves hurrying with tablets and parcels, the orators on the rostra still finding somewhere in themselves the energy for a last flourish before the light fails. But now the shadows are lengthening between the temple columns, stretching long and blue across the worn paving stones, and the crowd is thinning, the voices dropping, and there is something almost contemplative about the Forum at this hour. Those great stone structures standing very still in the last light, the Temple of Saturn with its thick ancient columns, the Basilica Aemilia with its long arcade, everything patient and solid and smelling faintly of the lamp oil that will soon be lit to hold back the night. The Tiber is audible from here, if you listen past the diminishing noise of the streets, not loud, never loud at this time of year, but present, a low and continuous sound beneath everything else. The river moving in its own unhurried way between its low banks, brown and thoughtful, and carrying on its surface the reflected orange of the sky. The river has its own smell too, something muddy and mineral and particular to this place, and it mixes in the evening air with the wood smoke from the Trans-Tiberum district on the western bank, where the poorer quarters of the city stretch away into a maze of narrow streets and crowded insulae, the tall tenement buildings already lit in their lower windows, the smell of frying onions and hot bread drifting out above the noise of families settling in for the night. There are perhaps 1 million people living within reach of these 7 hills, a number so large it is almost impossible to hold in the mind, and each of them is engaged right now in some particular version of the evening. A merchant counting the day's takings on a wooden abacus by lamplight, a soldier at the city gate changing the watch, a child being called in from a courtyard by a voice that carries exactly that mix of affection and exasperation that children have always inspired in the people who love them. An old man sitting on the steps of a small temple on the Palatine Hill, watching the light go. A woman drawing water from a street fountain while the water pours on steadily and calmly, as it has been pouring all day, fed by an aqueduct that stretches back across the flat plain outside the city for many miles. A marvel of patient engineering carrying water from distant hills to this one stone basin in this one quiet street. The aqueducts are perhaps the clearest way to understand what Rome is in this particular moment in the last decades before the birth of Christ, as the old republic gives its final shuddering breath and something new begins to take shape around the careful and watchful figure of a man named Octavian, who will soon be known as Augustus. The water runs because someone built the means to carry it, someone maintained it, someone made certain that the pressure was right and the joints were sealed and the arches were sound. And all of that represents a kind of confidence in the future, a belief that this city and this civilization will be here tomorrow and the day after and the year after that, needing its water, going about its life. That confidence has been sorely tested in the years we are approaching. The generation now reaching middle age has lived through civil wars and proscriptions, and the assassination of Julius Caesar in the Senate chamber, and the desperate, bewildering years that followed, when it seemed quite genuinely possible that everything, the Republic, the city, the whole long Roman project, might simply collapse into chaos and keep falling. But it has changed utterly, and the change is still settling. The new shape of things still hardening from something fluid into something fixed. And the man at the center of that change, Augustus, is building and legislating and making alliances with an energy that seems almost architectural, as though he is constructing not just a government but a world, brick by careful brick. It is into this world, this particular amber evening on these 7 hills, this city of smoke and water and lamplight and a million lives all pressing together on a bend of the Tiber, that a child will soon be born. A child of one of the oldest noble families in Rome, a child whose name will eventually become one of the most recognizable of the ancient world, a child who will grow into a man of considerable complexity, cautious, solitary, dutiful, melancholy, capable of greatness, and touched by shadow in equal measure. His name is Tiberius, and his story, like all long stories, begins not with the person himself but with the world that made him. This world, these hills, this evening, this particular quality of Roman light thickening to gold at the end of an ancient day. For now let that light hold you, warm and unhurried, the smoke rising from the cooking fires, the river moving quietly past its banks, the lamps beginning to glow in the windows across the hills as the darkness gathers gently around the city and everything slows and rests and breathes. Somewhere on one of those hills, in one of those lamplit houses, the next part of the story is already waiting. Somewhere in Rome tonight, a lamp is being trimmed, its small flame steadied against the dark. And it is into a world very much like that, full of uncertain light and the smell of warm oil and old stone, that we are going to travel together now, back through more than 2,000 years, to a city that was not yet an empire, not quite, though it was straining toward one, with every anxious breath it drew. And before we settle into that world, a soft word, if you will allow it. If these stories find you well, if they become the thing you reach for when sleep feels far away, you might consider finding this channel again and following it, subscribing in whatever way your nighttime screen allows, so that the stories are always there when you need them, gathered in one quiet place, night after night. And if you feel moved to leave a word in the comments, just a small one, just the name of the place where you are lying down tonight, the city or the country or the coast, you would be joining something rather lovely, a scattered, sleepy community of listeners all over the world, all of us adrift at roughly the same hour, all listening to the same lamplit past. Now, Rome, the year that the old calendar would one day call 42 before the birth of Christ, though no one living in it called it anything so neat or final. They called it, if they called it anything at all, a year of consuls, a year of disasters, a year in which the ground beneath every Roman family of standing felt as though it might give way without warning and swallow everything, the house, the name, the careful generations of accumulated dignity, in a single afternoon. The city itself was ancient already, layered and dense, its 7 hills worn smooth, in places by the passage of feet across centuries, its streets, narrow and loud in the daytime and eerie in the dark, smelling of bread and animals, and the river that moved through it all like a slow brown thought. The Tiber was never far from anything in Rome. You could hear it sometimes at night, if the city was quiet enough, a low murmur beneath the stones, patient and indifferent to whatever the Romans were doing to one another on its banks. It had seen the kings come and go. It had watched the Republic build itself up over 500 years of pride and principle and compromise and blood. It was watching now as all of that came apart, and it did not hurry, and it did not slow. Into this city, into this specific season of upheaval, a boy was born. His name, given in the full formal weight of Roman naming custom, was Tiberius Claudius Nero, and it was a name that carried within it the whole architecture of a very old and very serious family, the Claudii, one of the great patrician clans of Rome. The kind of family that traced its roots back so far into the city's founding myths that the roots themselves had become something between history and religion. To be a Claudius was to carry an enormous amount of Rome inside you before you had done a single thing of your own. It was to be born already shaped by expectation, already shadowed by the weight of ancestors who had held consulships and priesthoods and military commands going back to the days when Rome was still finding its edges. His father, also called Tiberius Claudius Nero, for Roman naming conventions were nothing, if not gloriously confusing, was a man of genuine ability and deeply inconvenient political instincts. He had served in Julius Caesar's campaigns, had been a capable naval commander, had held the kind of offices that a man of his standing was supposed to hold. But he had an unfortunate gift for finding himself on the losing side of things at precisely the wrong moment. And the Rome of 42 before the Common Era was a place where losing sides were not merely embarrassing but fatal. Julius Caesar had been dead for 2 years by the time the boy was born, stabbed on the floor of the Senate on the Ides of March in 44, and in the years since the men who had killed him and the men who had loved him had been tearing the Roman world apart between them with an energy that seemed almost inexhaustible in its appetite for destruction. The elder Tiberius Claudius Nero had not made things easier for himself or his family. He had, at various points, backed Brutus and Cassius, the men who had plunged their daggers into Caesar, and had done so with enough visible enthusiasm to make the matter memorable to exactly the people one would not wish to have remembering it. By the time the Battle of Philippi was fought and lost in October of that same year, 42 before the Common Era, the same year his son came into the world, the Caesarian forces under Octavian and Mark Antony had destroyed the last serious military resistance of the Republican cause, and the elder Nero found himself in an extremely precarious position. The boy's mother, Livia Drusilla, was 19 years old when she gave birth to Tiberius. She was, by every account that survives, and accounts would multiply around her across the decades, some reverential, some darker, a woman of exceptional intelligence and composure, the kind of person who seemed to grow more still and more controlled as the world around her grew more chaotic, as though difficulty were simply a medium in which she functioned particularly well. She came from the Livii and the Claudii both, another of the old families, another lineage weighted with history, and she had been married to the elder Nero when she was barely more than a child herself, as was entirely customary for women of her class in a world that did not consider this arrangement worthy of comment. What it was like to be Livia in those months, heavily pregnant with her first child, while the entire political order of the world she had been raised to inhabit collapsed around her, is not something the sources dwell on at any length, because the sources were not much interested in the interior lives of women, however extraordinary those women turned out to be. But it is not difficult to imagine the quality of those days, the way ordinary domestic sounds must have continued, even as extraordinary news arrived from the frontiers, a slave setting down a water jug, a fire being built up against the autumn cool, and somewhere outside, rumors moving through the streets like weather, impossible to outrun. He would prove to be healthy for a very long time, living well past what most Romans would have considered a full life, outlasting nearly everyone he grew up knowing, which was itself a kind of survival in a century that ate its prominent men with remarkable efficiency. The story goes that his father was delighted, or at least relieved. A son, a Claudius, another link in the long chain that ran back through the centuries to the founders and the founding. Whatever chaos was moving through the public world, a birth was still a birth, still something to be greeted with the proper rituals, the proper offerings, the proper acknowledgement that a new person had arrived, and the household gods had been informed. He was 9 days old when the purification ceremony would have been performed, when he would have been formally named in the Roman fashion, placed under the protection of his family's lairs and the small domestic warmth of the household shrine. A tiny flame burning for him, in a house that was already beginning to feel the chill of the world pressing in at its edges. For the triumph at Philippi had consequences that would reach all the way into this house, through these walls, past the lamp and the shrine, and the carefully maintained routine of a Roman aristocratic family trying to hold itself together. The winning side had won, and the winning side had long memories, and the elder Nero's past choices were not about to be overlooked simply because a child had been born and the autumn was settling gently over the 7 hills. There were harder roads ahead for this small family, roads that would be taken at night, in cold and uncertainty, carrying what could be carried. But for now, in this very early moment, let all of that remain still and distant, nothing more than a vague shape somewhere beyond the lamplight. Let the city outside settle into its nighttime quiet, the Tiber moving through the dark as it always has, and let the newest Claudius sleep in whatever warmth his household could arrange for him, unknowing and small, and just beginning. The lamp burns low. The road south out of Rome was cold that night, colder than the season should have allowed, and the stones of the Via Appia pressed hard and uneven beneath the wheels of a carriage that moved without lamps, without announcement, without any of the ceremony that a family of such ancient name might once have expected to accompany them on a journey. Tiberius Claudius Nero, not yet 4 years old, would have felt little of the political weight pressing down upon his family in those autumn weeks of 39 before the birth of Christ. He would have felt instead the particular cold of a child pulled from sleep too early, the wool of a traveling cloak rough against his cheek, the unfamiliar sway and lurch of motion in darkness, the sounds of his mother's breathing close beside him, and the low, urgent voices of men outside the carriage that meant something serious was happening in the world of adults, something that could not wait for morning. His mother was Livia Drusilla, a woman of extraordinary composure even then, even young, even frightened, though it is said she rarely showed that fear openly. His father was Tiberius Claudius Nero the Elder, a man who had chosen the losing side in the great and terrible contest that was consuming the Roman world, a man who had aligned himself with forces now crumbling beneath the advancing certainty of the man who would one day be called Augustus. The elder Nero had spoken too loudly in the wrong rooms, had supported the wrong commanders, had believed too late in causes already turning to dust, and now Rome was no longer safe for him or for anyone who bore his name. And so they fled, this small and noble and frightened family, carrying what could be carried, leaving behind the cool marble corridors and the familiar smells of their Roman house, the lamplight they had known, the steady flame of the household shrine that had burned in its alcove perhaps for generations, and they moved out into a darkness that had no reliable ending. The journey took them first toward the south, it is believed, and then into regions of Italy that were held by uncertain alliances, places where a man of the elder Nero's sympathies might find shelter for a night or two before moving on, before the political weather shifted again and made even temporary refuge dangerous. Travel in those years was not the measured progress of a man with a destination. It was more like water finding its way around stone, always deflected, always seeking the path of least resistance, never entirely sure where it would come to rest. For the child Tiberius, these months would have presented themselves as a series of sensory impressions with no particular narrative connecting them, the way early childhood always works, experience arriving in fragments rather than stories. The smell of someone else's house, not his own, the texture of a sleeping mat that was not the one he knew. Firelight in rooms he had not seen before, flickering against walls of unfamiliar stone, throwing shadows that did not belong to anyone he recognized. Cold flagstones beneath bare feet in the gray early mornings of places whose names he would not have known and could not have pronounced. The sound of rain on a roof that was not his roof, and the particular quality of quiet that comes when adults in the next room are speaking softly so that children cannot hear. It is said that the family eventually crossed to Sicily, where they hoped to find support among those who had not yet fully submitted to the new order gathering around the man then known as Octavian. Sicily was an island already ancient, beyond Roman memory, its harbors full of the accumulated centuries, its winds carrying the smell of thyme and salt, and the particular dryness of southern stone, baked by a sun that pressed down harder there than it did in the city the child had been born in. Whether Tiberius was old enough to register the sea crossing, to feel the swell of the water beneath the hull of whatever vessel carried them, to hear the creak of timber and the snap of sail, we cannot know with any certainty. But the sea was there, present and indifferent, moving beneath them as they moved across it. Sicily offered only partial comfort. The political situation there was complicated, as it was everywhere in those years when nothing was settled and every arrangement was provisional, every alliance conditional on outcomes not yet determined. The support the elder Nero sought did not materialize in the form he had hoped, and the family moved on again, this time across the water to Greece, to the Greek-speaking East, where old Roman families with Roman-style political difficulties sometimes found a different kind of breathing room. Greece in those years was a landscape of extraordinary beauty, worn thin by a very long history, its famous cities still carrying the names that every educated Roman knew from their reading, its temples still standing on their hills and promontories, its philosophers still teaching in the porticos of cities that had been teaching philosophy since before Rome had learned to write its own name. But it was also a landscape marked by the passage of armies, by the aftermath of battles that had been fought there only years before, by the visible evidence of what civil war does to places that have the misfortune of becoming its theater. The young Tiberius moved through all of this, carried, perhaps much of the time, or walking on small legs that tired quickly, watching with the wide and serious eyes that portraits of him in later life suggest he always had, that quality of watchfulness which seems to have been native to him from the beginning. He would not have understood what he was seeing. He would have understood only the immediate textures of each day, the cold of a mountain road, the dust of a drier one, the way his mother's hand felt when it held his, the smell of whatever small fire was built at the end of a long day's traveling to take the chill from whatever room they had found to sleep in. And there is a story told in later years that carries the particular quality of those months more vividly than any dry accounting of the family's movements could manage. It is said that on more than one occasion during these fugitive wanderings, as the family moved through unfamiliar territory in darkness, the infant or very young Tiberius cried out, or made some sound that might have drawn attention to a group of travelers who were trying very hard not to be noticed, and that on at least one such night, passing through a town or near the camp of soldiers whose sympathies could not be predicted, the danger of that small, involuntary cry was very real. Whether this story is precisely true in all its details, whether it happened once, or several times, or exactly as tradition describes it, we cannot say with confidence. But it feels true to the texture of those years, true to what it must have been like to be a family moving through a world at war with itself, responsible for keeping themselves invisible, carrying with them a child who did not yet know how to be quiet on command. The wandering went on for some time, measured in seasons rather than in precise months, before circumstances shifted enough to allow a return to Italy. The elder Nero eventually negotiated some form of accommodation with the new powers reshaping the Roman world, the kinds of weary arrangements that men made when the fighting grew too exhausting to continue, and the alternatives were too frightening to contemplate. Rome extended something like clemency, or perhaps it was simply that the elder Nero had become, in the calculations of the powerful, too small a matter to pursue further. Whatever the precise mechanism, the family returned. They came back to a city that was not quite the same city they had left. Cities rarely are, after years of upheaval. and Rome in those years was in the process of becoming something new, something still not entirely determined, but clearly moving toward a different arrangement of power than anything the Republic had ever formally acknowledged. The house they returned to, the lamplight relit in familiar rooms, the household shrine burning again in its alcove, all of this would have felt simultaneously the same and strangely altered, the way any home feels when you have been away long enough to have half forgotten its proportions. Tiberius was perhaps 5 or 6 years old when they settled again in Rome, old enough now for memories to begin forming with something like permanence, old enough for the city to start becoming legible to him as a place with meanings rather than simply a collection of sensations. The son of a noble family returned from exile would have begun soon enough the education proper to his station, would have begun learning what a Roman boy of his class was expected to learn, would have begun to understand that the world had a shape, even if that shape was still resolving itself from the upheaval of recent years. And the household into which he was settling, it should be said, was about to change in ways that would alter everything, ways that would lift him from the ordinary trajectory of a Roman nobleman's son and place him on a path of a very different kind entirely. But that larger story belongs to quieter mornings, to the rhythms of a new household just beginning to establish itself, to a fire burning steadily in rooms that had not yet become familiar. For now the road has been long enough. Rest here, in the knowledge that the wandering is over, that the cold stones of uncertain roads lie behind, and that somewhere ahead a lamp is burning, steady and warm. There is a particular quality to the light inside a Roman house in the early morning, when the lamps have been burning through the night, and the oil has grown low, and the flames have settled into something small and amber and perfectly still, barely trembling even when a door opens somewhere deeper in the corridors and sends the faintest breath of air moving through the atrium. It is a light that makes everything look ancient, even things that are new, even a child standing at the edge of a room he does not yet know, watching, learning, working out in silence where he belongs. Tiberius Claudius Nero was perhaps 4 years old, perhaps 5, when his mother Livia brought him and his infant brother Drusus into the household of Gaius Octavianus, the man the world was already beginning to call Augustus, the man who was already, in every way that mattered, the singular center of Roman life. The date is placed by most accounts somewhere around the year 38 before the birth of Christ, and the circumstances were those of a marriage, Livia's marriage to Octavian, one of those arrangements that carried within it all the weight and calculation and genuine feeling that the late Republic so often braided together until they were impossible to separate. Livia was considered even then one of the most remarkable women in Rome, composed, perceptive, and possessed of a stillness that seemed to contain rather than conceal her intelligence. She brought her sons into that marriage the way a careful traveler carries something precious, keeping them close, watching the road. The house on the Palatine Hill that would become their home was not by the standards of what Rome would eventually build in its imperial grandeur, an especially showy residence. It is said that Augustus preferred it that way, that he was deliberate in projecting an image of republican simplicity, sleeping on a modest bed, eating plain food, wearing garments that Livia herself sometimes wove. Whether this austerity was entirely genuine or partly performance is one of those questions that historians have debated very gently across the centuries, but what seems clear is that the house itself had a quality of purposefulness to it, of rooms arranged for work as much as for display, of corridors that were always, at almost every hour of the day, occupied by someone moving quietly towards some necessary task. For a child arriving in such a household, there would have been an almost overwhelming density of routine to observe and absorb. The mornings began early, as all Roman mornings did, with the business of salutation, the greeting of Augustus by those who owed him deference, a soft and ordered procession of senators and clients and freedmen and soldiers that flowed through the outer rooms in the first pale light. Day after day, the way children absorb the deepest lessons of their world, not through instruction, but through repetition, through the slow accumulation of small observed details that eventually coalesce into understanding. He would have seen how men composed their faces when they entered that room. He would have noticed which ones Augustus looked at directly and which ones received only a glance. He would have learned, in the wordless way of childhood, that power has a texture, a temperature, a particular kind of silence at its center. Augustus himself, is a figure about whom everything that can be said comes racked in some degree of uncertainty, refracted through the accounts of those who admired him enormously or feared him quietly, or both. What seems consistent across those accounts is a quality of controlled attention, an ability to hold many things in mind simultaneously while appearing to the person in front of him entirely present. It is easy to imagine that this quality would have impressed itself upon a watchful boy, that young Tiberius would have registered it the way one registers something that cannot quite be named, but that leaves a faint, permanent mark. Augustus was not his father. He was something more complicated than a father, and something less, and the shape of that relationship would take many years and many changes to settle into anything that either of them fully understood. The education of Tiberius within that household was serious and thorough, as one would expect from a family that understood education to be inseparable from preparation for public life. He would have studied rhetoric, that central art of Roman civilization, the ability to speak with precision and force and elegance in the spaces where decisions were made. He would have read Greek, which was considered not merely useful but essential for any educated Roman of the period, a language that opened worlds both literary and philosophical. It is said that he developed a genuine affection for Greek literature, for the old poets particularly, and that this affection stayed with him, becoming in later years one of the few private pleasures he permitted himself without apparent conflict. He studied music, as boys of his class did, and geometry, and the long, patient business of learning Roman law, which was less a subject than a kind of comprehensive training in the habit of careful thought. But perhaps the most important education that Tiberius received in those early years inside the Augustan household was not the kind that came from tutors or scrolls. It was the education of observation, of learning to read the movements of a world that was in the very process of remaking itself. The republic that his father had served and fled for was gone, or going, its forms still present but increasingly hollow, its old vocabularies of freedom and public virtue still spoken, but increasingly ceremonial. In its place, something new was being assembled, quietly, carefully, without ever being named too directly, a system in which one man stood at the center of everything, while the language of collective governance continued to be spoken all around him. Growing up inside that household meant growing up inside the construction site of that new world, hearing the decisions being made, watching the choices that shaped an empire, learning by proximity what could not be taught by any other means. His relationship with his stepbrother and half-sibling Drusus seems, in the accounts that have come down to us, to have been one of genuine warmth. Perhaps the earliest and most uncomplicated affection in what would become, over time, a life not especially rich in uncomplicated affections. Drusus was younger, easier in his manner, more naturally inclined toward the kind of openness that made him beloved by those who served under him. The two boys grew up close, sharing tutors and lessons, and the particular solidarity of children who have been placed by their circumstances into a world that requires them to behave always with a certain measure of care. There is something quietly touching in imagining them together in the inner rooms of the Palatine house, in those hours of the day when the formal business of the household was elsewhere, when the lamps burned low in their brackets, and the city outside settled into one of its brief, relative silences. As Tiberius grew from a child into a young man, the shape of what was expected of him began to clarify. He would speak at public ceremonies, as Augustus arranged for him to do from an early age, learning the controlled exposure of Roman public life. He would be seen and evaluated and measured against the standards that his world applied to young men of his class and position. He appeared at the games, where Augustus's family occupied the places of honor, and where the crowd's collective attention was itself a kind of education in the relationship between power and spectacle. He delivered the funeral oration for his natural father, when that time came, standing before a Roman audience and finding the words that the occasion required, and the accounts suggest that he found them well, that even as a boy he showed a facility with public speech that was precise and controlled, if not especially warm. The world of that household, the rhythms of its days, the lamplight in its mornings and its evenings, the soft constancy of its routines, all of this was forming something in Tiberius that would take decades more to fully emerge. He was learning patience in a house that rewarded it. He was learning watchfulness in a place where being watched was constant. He was learning to contain what he felt, because the household of the most powerful man in the world was also a place where what you showed on your face could travel, by nightfall, to ears you had never met. The lamps would burn through those years, guttering sometimes in the drafts that moved through Roman houses when the season changed and the air came cool off the Tiber, and Tiberius would grow older in their light, steadier, quieter, more deeply armored in his own careful silence. The city outside the walls of that house was always present, always audible, its carts and its voices and its bells and its distant water, and he was becoming slowly the kind of man who could live inside that noise and be untouched by it. In the years that followed, as his education widened and the expectations upon him grew more formal and more demanding, he would be called out of those interior rooms and into the larger world, the world of the Roman military, of the frontier, of the cold roads, and the long marches that would teach him things no house, however powerful, could ever quite prepare him for. The city stirs before it wakes. There's a moment in the last hollow darkness before the Roman dawn, when the 7 hills hold their breath together, when the dogs have quieted and the night jars have finished, and the first pale suggestion of light has not yet found the eastern edge of the sky above the Esquiline. The Tiber moves in that moment, slow and enormous, pewter dark and carrying the faint smell of river clay and distant rain, its surface unmarked by any oar or ferry pole. The temples on the Capitoline stand in absolute stillness, their columns ghostly pale, their pediments lost in shadow, and the whole enormous breathing fact of the city, perhaps 1 million souls sleeping, dreaming, shifting on their straw and their cushions and their fine Egyptian linen, rests suspended in that final, total quiet. And then, almost without announcement, the morning begins. It begins with the sound of a wheel on stone, a single cart, then another, then the gathering rumble of many, because the city of Augustus forbids wheeled traffic within its walls during the daylight hours, and so the night belongs to the merchants and the bakers and the drivers of oxen, and they have been moving through the darkened streets since long before midnight, and now they are making their final deliveries before the light forces them to stop. The wheels are iron-rimmed on volcanic cobblestone, and the sound they make is low and continuous and somehow reassuring. The sound of a city feeding itself in the dark, the sound of abundance arriving without ceremony from the fields and harbors and granaries that ring the capital in every direction. The bakers have been awake the longest. In the bakeries that line the streets of the Subura and the Aventine, and the neighborhoods pressed close against the Tiber, the ovens have been burning since deep in the night, and the smell of baking bread moves through the city like a slow tide, warm and yeasty and deeply human, drifting up narrow alleys and across tiled rooftops and into the upper windows of the insulae, where families are beginning to stir. The bread of Rome is serious bread, round and dense, marked with wedge cuts so that it can be broken into portions, and it will feed the city from its hundreds of bakeries and its public dole, the grain that comes from Egypt and Sicily and North Africa, crossing the sea in great fat-bellied transport ships, so that this city, this impossible city, may continue to eat. By the time the sky above the Forum Romanum has turned the color of pale ash, the city is already fully in motion. The Forum itself, that ancient layered sacred rectangle of stone and memory at the heart of everything, receives the morning the way an old theater receives its first actors, not with surprise, but with a kind of grave readiness. And they glisten with the night's damp, and the temples that ring the open space are still in early shadow. The temple of Saturn with its 8 great columns of gray stone, the temple of Vesta with its circular form, modest and ancient, where the sacred flame burns always, tended through the night, just as it has been tended for centuries beyond counting. The flame is the city's oldest heartbeat, and it asks nothing more than to continue. The men who arrive first in the Forum are the ones with business to conduct before the heat of the day, the lawyers and their clients, the money changers settling behind their low tables, the scribes who set up in the shadow of the basilicas, with their wax tablets and their styluses, ready to draft contracts and petitions and letters for those who need words put into careful official form. They arrive wrapped in their togas, which in the early morning chill seem both grand and slightly inconvenient. Great swaths of undyed wool that must be draped just so, that catch the early light and make the Forum look as though it has been visited by a slow procession of pale, dignified ghosts. The toga is the garment of the citizen, the mark of belonging to this particular civilization, and wearing it well is itself a kind of argument, a claim made silently and continuously to all who pass. The smells of the forum change as the morning deepens. The cold stone smell of the early hours gives way to the smell of burning offerings from the temple altars, a thin, sacred smoke of incense and grain, and sometimes the richer, heavier smell of an animal sacrifice. The smoke drifting sideways in the light breeze that comes off the Tiber and crosses the low rooftops. Then comes the smell of the food vendors who set up along the edges of the open space, the sellers of sausages cooked over small charcoal braziers, the sellers of hot chickpeas and lentils and little fried cakes drizzled with honey, the smell of warm fat and char and sweetness, all woven together into something that is the specific, irreplaceable smell of Rome alive and hungry and occupied with itself. The baths open later in the morning, and they are one of the great gifts of the city to its inhabitants. Even the public baths available to ordinary Romans, and there are many, dozens scattered through every neighborhood, are remarkable places. Their rooms warm and steaming, lit by high windows through which the morning light falls in long golden columns through the vapor. You move through them in sequence, from the cool room to the warm room to the hot room, from the dip of cold water that closes the pores and shocks the breath, and all around you is the sound of conversation, because the baths are where Rome talks to itself. Business is discussed in the warm room, with men leaning back against the stone benches and speaking of grain prices and property and what is being said in the Senate. Philosophy is attempted in a half-serious way in the cool room, where someone is always ready to take a position and defend it with gestures. And underneath all of it runs the constant low sound of water, water moving through the pipes beneath the floors and behind the walls, water that has been carried to this city across the plain from distant springs on the great arched aqueducts, those extraordinary stone bridges that stride across the Campagna and empty themselves into the city in a perpetual generous abundance, so that Rome, almost uniquely in the ancient world, is a city with enough water to be clean. By midday, the markets are at their most vivid. The markets of Rome fill not just the formal market spaces. The great market of Trajan would come later. But there are already covered markets and open stalls spread across the city. But every street and alley and open corner where a vendor can lay down a cloth and arrange goods upon it. The produce that arrives from the countryside and the river barges fills the stalls with color that seems almost excessive. Dark purple figs from Calabria, set out on wide fig leaves, ropes of garlic white as bone, lettuces the soft green of new growth, clay amphorae of olive oil sealed with wax, dried fish from the coast, arranged in careful rows, live birds in wicker cages adding their voices to everything else. The fishmonger near the river sells from a marble-topped counter, worn smooth by years of use, and the smell of his stall carries far on the warm air, not unpleasant in the morning freshness, a smell of brine and cold depth, and the sea from which all food ultimately arrives. The noise of the Roman street in full morning is something that would be, to a later ear, almost incomprehensibly layered. The creak and thud of shops opening, their heavy wooden shutters lowered and converted into counters, the calls of vendors announcing their goods in voices trained to carry across the roar of the crowd, the arguments that flare suddenly and subside just as quickly, the clatter of pots, the laughter from a tavern where someone has already begun drinking despite the early hour, the sound of a hammer from a metalworker's shop where a man is beating iron into a shape it did not previously have, the barking of dogs, the crowing of a rooster from someone's upper floor garden, and underneath all of it, faint but continuous, the sound of water running through the city's many public fountains. Those stone basins, where anyone may drink, where children splash and women fill their jars, and where the overflow runs in a thin, bright stream along the gutter between the stepping stones. It is in this city, noisy, fragrant, warm, ancient, endlessly busy with the business of being itself, that a young man of the House of Augustus is learning what it means to live inside power. He walks these streets, breathes this air, hears these sounds, carries within him the particular experience of someone who has known cold roads and uncertain shelter, and now finds himself returned to warmth and abundance and the close attention of the most important household in the world. How those earlier years of flight and hardship have settled in him, what they have made of the quiet young man with serious eyes, That is something the next turning of the lamplight will begin to reveal. And for now, the Roman morning simply continues, as it always has, the water running, the bread cooling, the smoke rising, the city breathing. The road north out of Rome begins before the sun does. In the cold hours before first light, when the city is still wrapped in its own breathing, and the oil lamps along the Aventine gutter low against the dark, the legions move. They do not announce themselves with trumpets at that hour, not when the march is long and the mountains are still many days ahead. They simply begin, one foot and then the other, the sound of hobnailed sandals on stone, rising slowly into something that resembles at a distance the rushing of a river. And it was into this world, the world of early mornings and long roads, and the smell of leather and wood smoke and cold iron, that Tiberius Claudius Nero, still young, still finding the shape of himself, first stepped with something approaching belonging. He had been given his first real military responsibility around the age of 17, which was not unusual for a young man of his family and standing. Rome expected its noble sons to learn the business of war early, to stand in the field and absorb its lessons before those lessons had a chance to become fatal through ignorance. What was perhaps less expected was the degree to which Tiberius seemed to take to it, not with the burning eagerness of a boy who craves glory, but with something quieter and more durable, a steady attention to the work itself, to the logistics of supply and the management of men, and the patient reading of terrain that separates a competent general from a merely brave one. His first significant assignment carried him east, toward Armenia, that complicated kingdom balanced perpetually between the gravitational pulls of Rome and Parthia, its kings often installed or removed by outside hands, its politics a slow-moving drama of loyalty and betrayal, conducted at very great distances. Tiberius was sent as part of the effort to restore a Roman-favored king to the Armenian throne, and the story goes that he conducted himself with a composure that impressed even the seasoned officers who accompanied him. He was not yet 20, and yet he sat in council meetings with the gravity of someone who had spent years learning when to speak and when to hold silence. The court of Augustus had, at least, prepared him in that. The east had its own textures, its own quality of light. The mornings there arrived with a particular sharpness, the sun rising over dust-colored hills in a way that made everything look briefly like hammered bronze, and the air carried smells that Rome did not have. Spices from markets farther east than most Romans would ever travel, the resinous smoke of unfamiliar wood, the dry heat that came off stone that had been baking since long before any Roman set foot in it. Tiberius moved through all of it, with his characteristic careful attention, watching, measuring, filing things away in whatever interior archive he had been quietly building since childhood. He had learned early that the world rewarded those who paid attention, and he paid attention the way other men breathed, constantly, without particular effort, and with the sense that stopping would be dangerous. After Armenia came the harder work. Pannonia, that broad and difficult region lying roughly where the middle of the great river Danube bends through forested hills and marshland, had been restless for years, its tribes pressing against Rome's administrative authority with the patient stubbornness of people who had been here long before Rome arrived and expected to be here long after. The campaigns Tiberius conducted in Pannonia, and they were not quick campaigns, not clean, decisive strokes, but the grinding, muddy, difficult work of subduing territory that did not wish to be subdued, revealed something important about him as a commander. He was careful with his men in a way that was noticed and, it is said, appreciated by the legionaries who served under him. He did not spend lives for the sake of a dramatic gesture. He preferred the slow encirclement to the glorious charge, the secured supply line to the inspired gamble, and in territory like Pannonia, in conditions of cold and mud and forest, and the particular misery of a campaign that has no obvious end, those qualities were worth more than brilliance. The Roman soldier's world was a world of fire, in its way. The campfire was its center, the fixed point around which everything else organized itself at the end of each day's march. The legionaries would have their fires going before the tents were fully raised, the smoke rising up in pale columns against whatever color the evening sky had settled on. And around those fires, the ordinary business of survival took place. Boots dried, rations cooked, blisters tended to, the low murmur of men talking about nothing in particular, because talking about nothing in particular is what men do when they are tired and far from home. Tiberius walked among those fires in the evenings, it is said, not with the theatrical warmth of a general performing closeness to the common soldier, but with something more reserved and perhaps more genuine, a presence that acknowledged the shared difficulty of the work without making speeches about it. The Rhine frontier was in some ways the most formative of his postings, not for any single campaign, but for the cumulative weight of years spent in the north, in a landscape so different from the sun-baked stone of Rome or the eastern dust of Armenia. The Rhine country was green in a way that felt almost excessive to eyes accustomed to the Mediterranean palette, a deep and various green that darkened toward the river and darkened further still into the great forests on the other side, which the Romans called simply the Germania and regarded with a mixture of military assessment and something that came close to unease. The river itself was wide and gray-brown and moved with a quiet authority, and on clear mornings the light on the water had a particular cold silver quality that Tiberius would have seen many hundreds of times from the western bank, standing in that watchful stillness that seemed to be his natural posture in the world. He commanded the legions on the Rhine with, by most accounts, considerable effectiveness. He kept discipline without unnecessary cruelty, which was not as common a combination as one might hope. He reorganized the logistics of the frontier in ways that made the long business of maintaining it somewhat less grinding for the men who did the maintaining, and he built or oversaw the building of the kind of durable infrastructure, roads and forts and supply depots, that speaks less to a desire for glory and more to an understanding that an empire is held together not by heroic moments, but by 10,000 unglamorous decisions made correctly over a very long period of time. What the Rhine years gave him, beyond the practical education of command, was something harder to name, a certain seasoning of the self, a quality that comes only from having been cold and tired and far from comfort for long enough that one stops expecting comfort and begins instead simply to work within the world as it is rather than as one would prefer it. Tiberius had always been somewhat inward, somewhat contained, a young man who kept his own counsel even when it might have been easier not to. The campaigns deepened that quality, gave it a foundation of tested competence, rather than mere temperamental reserve. He knew now, from the inside, what it was to be responsible for men and for outcomes, to make decisions in the dark with incomplete information, and then to live with what followed. And there was satisfaction in it, quiet and real. The satisfaction that comes not from applause, but from the work itself going well, from the frontier holding, from the legions marching in good order, from the smoke of the evening campfires rising straight and unhurried into skies that had begun to darken towards stars. The soldier's road had given him something he had perhaps not expected to find, a version of himself that he recognized and could trust. The boy who had fled Rome in the dark with frightened parents was still somewhere in him, naturally as our old selves always are, but he had been joined now by someone steadier, someone who had stood on the edge of the empire and watched the gray river move and known that the work was difficult and done it anyway. He would carry that steadiness with him back to Rome, back to the world of the imperial household and its complicated human weather. Though what waited for him there, in the private chambers of his life, would prove harder than any frontier. For there are roads the body travels, and roads the heart travels, and they are not always the same road, and they do not always lead to the same place. But that lies just ahead, waiting quietly, like the city itself, always lit, always humming somewhere beneath its skin. For now the campfires are banking low, and the night is still, and the road is a long pale line leading home through the dark. The lamps are burning low across the Palatine tonight, and somewhere in the city a door is closing softly, the way doors close when something has already been decided, when the words have been spoken and the arrangements made and nothing remains but the quiet, irreversible settling of a new shape upon a life. It is 11 before the birth of Christ, or thereabouts, and Tiberius Claudius Nero is a young man who has already known more of the world than most men twice his age will ever know. He has marched the dusty roads of Armenia and felt the cold bite of the Rhine wind against his face. He has commanded legions and negotiated with kings and carried the weight of Roman authority on shoulders that were shaped for exactly that purpose. He is, by any measure that Rome would recognize, a success. He is capable and dutiful and admired in the way that serious, competent men are admired when they have not yet made the mistake of being too human in public. And he is, in the quiet hours, a man who loves his wife. Her name is Vipsania Agrippina, and she is the daughter of Marcus Agrippa, the great general who had been for so long the right hand of Augustus himself. She and Tiberius had been betrothed when she was very young, little more than a child, and he not so much older, and the marriage, when it finally came, had settled over him the way a warm room settles over a traveler who has been a long time in the cold. She was gentle, the ancient sources suggest, and steady, and she had given him a son, a boy named Drusus, who carried in his small face all the hope that a father is allowed to feel. It is said that Tiberius was not a man who showed his feelings easily or often, that the walls he kept around himself were thick and well maintained, but that within those walls with Vipsania, something softer lived, something he did not have to armor. And then Augustus decided that his daughter needed a husband. Julia was the only child of the first emperor, and she had already been married twice, first to the young Marcellus, whom Augustus had hoped would be his heir, and then to Agrippa himself, Vipsania's own father, a match arranged with the cold practicality that the imperial household had already learned to apply to the lives of its members. Agrippa had died, and Julia was a widow with children, and a father who needed her placed where she would be most useful, most stabilizing, most firmly woven into the fabric of succession. And Tiberius, the stepson of Augustus, the proven soldier, the heir Augustus had not yet formally named, but was already beginning to regard as necessary, Tiberius was the obvious choice. The obvious choice for everyone except Tiberius. What passed between him and Augustus in the conversations that led to this arrangement, we cannot know with any certainty. The record does not preserve the texture of those meetings, only their outcome. But the outcome speaks clearly enough. Tiberius was instructed to divorce Vipsania. He obeyed. He was instructed to marry Julia. He obeyed that too. Because that is what men of his family, men of his formation, men who had grown up inside the machinery of Roman duty and obligation, and the terrible gravity of the imperial household did. They obeyed. They arranged their faces into the appropriate expressions, and they did what was required of them, and they carried the rest somewhere else, somewhere interior and unvisited, and very quiet. The divorce would have been a formal legal thing, accomplished with the brisk efficiency that Roman law applied to the dissolution of marriages. Papers, witnesses, the return of the dowry, the polite administrative tidying of what had been a home. Tiberius would have stood through all of it with that composure he wore like a second skin, and perhaps no one watching him would have seen anything at all worth noting. But Suetonius tells us, and here we are on ground that feels true even if we hold it gently, that later, after the divorce had been completed and the arrangements for the new marriage were underway, Tiberius caught sight of Vipsania somewhere in the city. In the street perhaps, or at some public occasion where their paths could not be redirected in time, and that he followed her with his eyes for a long moment, in a way that was noticed, in a way that was not the composure anyone was accustomed to seeing from him, and that after this was observed, steps were taken to ensure he would not encounter her again. That detail, small as it is, carries a great weight of sadness in the way that small true things often do. The marriage to Julia took place, and Rome watched it with the complicated interest that Rome brought to everything concerning the imperial family. Julia was, by all accounts, a vivid and intelligent woman, spirited in ways that the Augustan household did not always welcome, fond of pleasures and company, and the particular freedom that a woman of her position and confidence might seek in a city full of brilliant, attentive men. She and Tiberius were, it seems fair to say, entirely unsuited to one another in the ways that matter most, which is to say in the quiet daily ways, in the texture of an evening, in the particular language of ease and understanding that a long shared life can build, and that cannot be constructed by arrangement. They had a child together, a son who did not survive infancy, and that loss, which history notes without dwelling on, must have settled like another stone into the space between them. After that, it is said that they lived largely separately, that the marriage that had been arranged for the good of Rome provided very little good to either of its members, that Tiberius moved through those years with a kind of careful, contained endurance, attending to his duties, maintaining his responsibilities, doing what was required with the thoroughness that never seemed to leave him. The city around them went on in its way, The forum loud with commerce and rhetoric in the mornings, the temples receiving their offerings, the smoke of sacrifices rising in the still air above the Capitoline Hill. The lamps in the great houses of the Palatine burned through the evenings, casting their amber light over dinner couches and mosaic floors, and the faces of people who smiled when the occasion called for it, and thought their private thoughts behind their public expressions. Rome was very good at surfaces. Tiberius had been raised in Rome. What he carried inside during those years, what the silence of a marriage that was not a marriage felt like when the city was finally quiet, and the lamp on the table burned down toward its base, we can only imagine, because he did not tell us, or if he did, the words did not survive. He was not a man who confided easily. He was not a man who asked for sympathy or invited it. He was a man who had learned very young, in the flight from Rome when the civil wars were tearing everything apart, that the world did not arrange itself for the convenience of anyone's heart, and that survival required a kind of steady interior silence that looked from the outside like coldness. Perhaps he stood sometimes at a window in those years, looking out over the city spread below in the darkness, the 1,000 small fires of 1,000 households flickering in the warm Roman night, each one a different life, a different arrangement of love and necessity, and felt the particular ache of a man who knows exactly what he has lost and understands that the losing of it was not a mistake, but a duty, which is perhaps the hardest kind of loss to make peace with, because there is no one to blame and nowhere to direct the feeling, and nothing to do with it except carry it, quietly, for as long as carrying is required. That carrying in time would take him far from Rome. There is a sea to the east that rolls in long, slow swells against pale limestone shores, an island where the philosophers walked in the afternoon heat, and the fishing boats came in at evening, with their catches gleaming silver in the last of the light, and the wind off the Aegean smelled of salt and wild thyme, and a silence very different from the silence of the Palatine. Tiberius would find his way there eventually, as a man finds his way to whatever it is he has been moving toward, without quite admitting it, even to himself. But for now, the lamps are still burning on the Palatine, and the night is long, and there is no need to travel anywhere at all. The flame settles low and steady, and the city breathes, and somewhere in its quiet heart, a man who has given everything that was asked of him sits with what remains, and the night holds him gently, as the night holds everyone in the end, with equal and unhurrying patience. The decision came quietly, the way deep decisions often do, not announced by any trumpet or preceded by any grand argument conducted in the open air of the forum, but arriving instead in the private chambers of a man who had carried too much for too long, settling over him the way a heavy woolen cloak settles over tired shoulders at the end of a long march, with a kind of relief that is almost indistinguishable from surrender. Tiberius was 35 years old when he asked Augustus for permission to leave Rome, and the request bewildered the city in a way that very few things could. He was by then one of the most accomplished men in the empire, a general of proven and considerable skill, a diplomat who had negotiated with kings, a stepson of the most powerful man in the world, and he wished, he said, simply to rest, to study, to withdraw. The word he used was something close to weariness, though those around him suspected, and history has generally agreed, that the weariness was not merely of the body, but of something less easily named, something that had accumulated in him across the years of forced marriage and public duty and private grief, the slow sediment of a life lived always in service to another man's design. It is said that Augustus was initially reluctant to grant this request, that he attempted through various gentle means to persuade his stepson to remain, even staging a public illness of his own, so that Tiberius might feel the weight of abandoning him in a moment of need. But Tiberius, who had so rarely insisted on anything for himself, insisted on this, and in the end permission was granted, and the ships were made ready, and Rome watched with a bewilderment edged in something very close to scandal as one of its great men sailed quietly away into the blue expanse of the Tyrrhenian Sea. The island of Rhodes lay far to the east, a small jewel of green and white rising from the waters of the Aegean, and it had been for centuries a place of learning and of quiet civilization, known for its schools of rhetoric and philosophy, for its harbor and its ancient colossus, long since fallen, and for a quality of light that seemed to fall differently there than elsewhere, softer somehow, more considered, as though the sun itself were less interested in blazing and more interested in illuminating. Travelers who had been there described the afternoons as long and golden and unhurried, the evenings as something very close to perfect, the air carrying always the faint mineral coolness of the sea, mixed with the dusty warmth of sun-baked stone. It was to this island that Tiberius came, in the year that historians would later mark as 6 before the birth of Christ, and it was here that he would remain for what would prove to be nearly 7 years, though no one, least of all Tiberius himself, could have predicted at the outset that the exile would stretch so long. He arrived without great ceremony, it is said, and appeared almost immediately to relax into the rhythms of the island in a way that suggested this was not a performance of retirement, but a genuine settling, a man finding at last the speed at which he actually wished to move through his days. He attended lectures at the schools of philosophy, sitting among the students, not as a dignitary to be accommodated, but as a listener genuinely engaged, wrapping his toga around him against the morning cool and following the arguments with careful attention. He walked, a great deal and often alone, along the paths that wound through the groves of olive trees and between the pale limestone walls of the island's quieter neighborhoods. And he visited the harbors in the early hours before the heat arrived, watching the fishing boats return with their slow and heavy cargo, the men hauling their nets with the unhurried competence of people who have done the same thing every morning for their entire lives. There was something in that steadiness that seemed to restore him, something in the sight of ordinary labor, conducted without theater or ambition, and he sought it out often. He kept company with scholars and with travelers, with men of letters who came to Rhodes because its libraries were good and its conversation unhurried. And there are accounts gently offered by ancient writers of Tiberius moving through these circles with a sociability that those who knew him only from Rome might have found surprising, a man more at ease in the company of ideas than he had ever appeared in the company of senators. He read widely, studied the stars with something approaching devotion, and maintained a correspondence with astronomers whose work he had followed for years. The nights on Rhodes were extraordinary for stargazing. The air clear and dry, the horizon unobstructed by city smoke, the darkness complete in a way that Rome, with its oil lamps and its noise and its ceaseless activity, could never quite achieve. And it is pleasant to imagine Tiberius standing on some terrace above the Aegean in the deep quiet of midnight, watching the slow wheel of the constellations, with the focused serenity of a man who has finally been permitted to direct his attention toward something that matters only to himself. But the years passed, and what had begun as rest did not remain entirely uncomplicated. Rome did not simply release a man of Tiberius's standing from its gravitational field without consequences, and as the months accumulated, his position became increasingly ambiguous. Augustus had adopted other heirs, younger men, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, the sons of his daughter Julia and the late General Agrippa, and these young men now stood closer to the center of Roman power than Tiberius did, the distance between Rhodes and Rome measuring not merely in miles of open water, but in the subtler distances of political relevance. Letters came less frequently. Requests to return home were made and then, when Tiberius showed no eagerness, allowed to lapse. There is a quality of waiting in all of this that the ancient sources describe with a kind of quiet sympathy, a man who had placed himself outside the great mechanism and now found that the mechanism was content to proceed without him, which was perhaps what he had wanted, and perhaps was not, in the still hours of those long Aegean nights, entirely what he had expected. He sought, it is said, an extension of his tribunician authority from Augustus, that constitutional privilege that gave its holder a certain formal standing in Roman political life, and the request was granted only reluctantly and briefly, a sign, if one were watching closely, of how much the emperor's favor had cooled. Without that privilege, Tiberius was simply a private citizen on a Greek island, however distinguished his ancestry, and however remarkable his past service. And there were moments in those later years on Rhodes when his situation became genuinely uncomfortable, when men who might once have cultivated his attention now passed him without undue interest, when visitors from Rome brought news of the court that reminded him, quietly but insistently, that the world of power had arranged itself in new configurations that left no particular space for his return. He endured this with the patience that seemed, even then, to be his most fundamental quality, a patience that was not quite resignation, and not quite hope, but something in between, a disciplined willingness to inhabit the present moment without demanding that it resolve into anything in particular. He continued his walks. He continued his studies. He watched the light move across the harbor water in the morning, gold and then silver, and then the flat, bright shimmer of midday. And he sat in the shade during the long, hot afternoons, and he read, and he thought, and he waited, though he would not have called it that, not precisely. And the water of the Aegean, which had carried him to this island in the first place, continued its patient work around the edges of Rhodes, wearing the limestone headland smooth, and depositing its small deposits of salt at the tide line, indifferent to the movements of emperors and heirs and exiled generals alike, concerned only with the ancient rhythms of wave and recession, the endless quiet conversation between the sea and the shore that has been going on since long before the first Roman ship set its course eastward across these particular waters, and will continue long after the last lamp has been extinguished on the last Roman hill. The island held him, quietly and without drama, and he remained, and the years turned, and somewhere far to the west, in the palace on the Palatine, things were beginning to change in ways that would eventually reach even Rhodes and even Tiberius, though the news would come slowly, as all news did then, carried across the water by sailors who did not know what they were carrying, wrapped in the ordinary motion of the sea. The harbor comes to you first, before anything else. The soft, rhythmic knock of wooden hulls against stone, the low creak of rope drawn tight and then released. The whole breathing world of a port that has no particular urgency this morning, no fleet to dispatch, no general to receive with ceremony and trumpet. Rhodes simply floats here in its ancient blue, a place that has been receiving ships and sending them away again for longer than memory runs clearly. And the Aegean comes and goes around it like a great slow exhalation, like the tide of something far larger than weather or season. The water is everywhere on this island, not just at its edges, but in the quality of the air itself, in the fine salt mist that settles on stone walls in the early morning, in the way the light bends and shimmers even inland, even among the olive trees, where you might walk for an hour without glimpsing the sea, and still feel it present all around you, a blue hum beneath everything, a distant patience. It is the kind of island that teaches patience simply by being itself, simply by asking nothing of you that cannot wait until the afternoon, until tomorrow, until the season turns. The mornings come in gently here. There is no sudden Roman daylight, no noise of carts released from the overnight curfew on cobblestones, no shouting at slaves in narrow streets, no distant roar of the city finding its voice before you are ready to hear it. Instead, there is a gradual brightening, a gray that softens to lavender and then to the faintest gold along the eastern water, and birds begin their observations quietly, one at a time, as if each is considering whether it is truly necessary to speak before proceeding. The air carries thyme and warm stone, and something faintly saline, something the wind brings from open water, far to the east, from distances that have no Roman names. In the harbor itself, the fishermen have already been and returned, or perhaps they have not yet gone. Time moves differently here, and the distinction between very late and very early becomes philosophical rather than practical, in the small hours before the sun has settled its opinion. Their boats rest low in the water, dark tarred wood with a faint iridescent sheen, where the scales of many mornings have left their silver memory. Nets lie spread along the quayside, drying in arrangements that look almost deliberate, almost like writing in a script no one has quite decoded. There is a man walking the harbor road this morning, moving slowly, hands folded behind his back, in the manner of someone whose thoughts have outpaced his feet, and who is waiting patiently for the two to reconcile. He is not young, though neither is he old, and he carries about him the faint quality of a person accustomed to being recognized, accustomed to a certain arrangement of space around him. Though here on Rhodes that space is not always given, and sometimes a fisherman passes without looking up, and sometimes a Greek scholar from the gymnasium nods and walks on, and both of these things are, it is said, among the reasons the man has chosen to be here at all. He walks as someone walks when they are not being watched, which is to say more honestly, with longer pauses at the water's edge, with more time given to simply looking out at the place where the sky meets the sea, and deciding there is nothing yet that needs to be done about it. Further from the harbor, inland and upward along roads where the stones are warm even in early morning, because the sun has been working on them since long before anyone arrived to notice, the olive trees begin. They are very old, many of them, old in the way that olive trees are old without apology or performance. Their trunks twisted into shapes that look like effort, like decades of reaching for something just slightly beyond them, though perhaps that is only how wood chooses to grow when it has enough time and enough silence. Their leaves are silver on one side, green on the other, and when the sea wind comes up the hillside, they all turn at once, and the whole grove goes bright and pale in a long, soft wave, like a held breath released. The ground beneath them is dry and fragrant, scattered with the small dark fruits that have been falling undisturbed, and lizards consider their territories on the exposed roots with the absolute seriousness of very small magistrates. There are places on the island given over to quieter work, rooms where the light comes in through high narrow windows and falls across wooden tables covered in papyrus rolls, rooms where two men might sit across from one another and discuss the nature of the heavens or the proper reading of a difficult line of Thucydides for an entire morning without either of them feeling that time has been poorly used. The scholars of Rhodes had long been known throughout the Mediterranean world, and it is said that men came here from Alexandria and from Athens and from places further east to study rhetoric, to sit with teachers who had thought carefully about what words were for and how they could be arranged to carry the weight of meaning across great distances of time. A man who had arrived from Rome, carrying the habits of a soldier and a politician, might sit in such a room and find that the hours passed differently, that a question well asked was its own kind of answer, that there was a pleasure in learning that had nothing to do with advancement or strategy or being seen to be learned. The afternoons are the island's great gift. If the mornings belong to the harbor and the late morning to the hills, the afternoons belong to no one, or rather they belong to whoever is willing to simply be still inside them. The heat comes down without urgency, and the shadows of the olive trees pool and settle, and somewhere in the middle distance a goat bell rings once and is not answered. The sea goes a deeper blue, almost violet in certain hours, and the light on the water is no longer sharp, but soft, broken into 1,000 small gleams that shift and reform like thoughts that have almost become words, and then thought better of it. A man with nowhere to be, with no campaign awaiting, with no expectation pressing at him from the direction of Rome, might stand at the edge of a cliff on such an afternoon and feel himself becoming quieter inside, layer by layer, the way the sea at night becomes quieter, though it never truly stops. The harbor lanterns are lit one by one, their reflections laid out in long amber lines across the water, trembling slightly, breaking and remaking themselves with each small wave. The smell of oil burning mixes with the smell of bread and the smell of the sea, and somewhere music comes from an open door, strings plucked slowly, a melody that does not seem to be going anywhere in particular, and is entirely content with that. People sit outside in the cooling air and speak quietly or do not speak, and the stars come out over the Aegean in numbers that Rome, with all its light and smoke, had long since ceased to offer. And they are very old stars, very patient, accustomed to looking down on islands and harbors, and men walking slowly by the water, long after everyone else has gone in. This is what Rhodes gives, night after night, and what, the story goes, a man who had known the full weight of Rome, the forum, and the campaigns, and the politics, and the marriage, and the loss of the thing he loved, might come to need more than he had known he needed it. Not happiness exactly, because happiness requires too much noise, but something quieter than happiness, and perhaps more sustaining, the feeling of the breath finding its own depth again, of the body remembering what it is when it is not performing anything for anyone. The water laps against the harbor stones all through the night in Rhodes, unhurried and consistent, neither restless nor resigned, simply present. The way the sea is always simply present, carrying its salt and its distance and its indifference to Roman things with an equanimity that no emperor ever quite managed to legislate. And in the dark of the island, someone sleeps who has not slept so well in years, and outside his window the Aegean continues its ancient conversation with the shore, and the olive trees hold still in the windless night, and the stars wheel slowly overhead. and there is, for this one chapter of a long life, something very close to peace. But Rome does not forget the people it has made, and across the water to the west things are changing, as things in Rome are always changing, and the quiet of Rhodes will not last forever. Though for now it holds beautifully, and there is no need tonight to think of anything beyond the sound of the sea and the soft amber memory of harbor lights trembling on dark water. The harbor smells of salt and pine resin and the faint sweetness of fish drying on wooden racks in the morning air. And if you have been listening along these past several nights, you will remember the sea, that wide Aegean Sea that held Tiberius for nearly 7 years in its slow blue embrace, the waters of Rhodes moving gently beneath his solitary walks, beneath the olive trees, beneath the particular silence of a man who has chosen, or perhaps been forced, to stop. That sea is still present tonight, though we are leaving it now, or rather, it is releasing him, slowly, unhurriedly, the way the sea releases everything eventually, with a kind of indifferent grace. It is the year that we would number as 2 before the birth of Christ, though no one living then would have named it so. And Tiberius has been on Rhodes for what feels to those in Rome who remember him like a very long absence indeed. He has written letters, he has studied, he has walked the same pale roads until he knows every stone, and he has waited, though whether he knew he was waiting, whether the waiting felt purposeful or simply like the texture of his days, is something the old accounts do not quite tell us. They only record that when the word finally came, when Augustus, through intermediaries, through the slow machinery of imperial correspondence and careful diplomacy, indicated that his stepson might return, Tiberius did not rush. He would have prepared methodically. That was always his nature. The careful arrangement of things, the checking and rechecking, a soldier's habit of knowing what he carried and where everything was stowed. His books, perhaps, packed in leather cases lined against the damp. His plain clothing, the kind he had always preferred, the rougher fabrics that senators sometimes found surprising in a man of his standing. The records suggest he had kept few attendants on Rhodes, had moved among the islanders with something approaching ordinary life, greeting the philosophers and the learned men in the gymnasium, not as a Roman nobleman requiring deference, but as a fellow student of the world. All of that was ending now, and he would have known it. The crossing back to the mainland would have taken the better part of several days, depending on the wind, and we might imagine him standing at the bow in the early morning when the sea was still glassy and the light was young and gold, watching the horizon slowly change its character. Ahead lay a world that had reorganized itself entirely in his absence. Behind him lay 7 years of quiet that he would never quite recover, or perhaps that he would never quite surrender. There is a kind of stillness that settles into a person when they have lived long enough with only themselves for company, and Tiberius carried it back with him like a garment he could not fully remove. Rome was not the city he had left. Or rather, it was the same city, the same 7 hills, breathing the same river-damp air, the same smoke rising from the same 10,000 hearths at evening, the same sound of cartwheels echoing on stone after dark when the daytime traffic was forbidden. But the arrangements of people within it had shifted in ways that were both subtle and enormous. Gaius and Lucius Caesar, the young grandsons of Augustus, whom the emperor had so carefully elevated and groomed and presented to the legions as the future of everything, were both dead. Gaius had died in the east, Lucius before him in the west, and the deaths had left Augustus, aging now, the vigor of his earlier decades worn thin by time and illness, and the particular exhaustion of having held an empire together by the force of his own careful personality, without the successors he had so long envisioned. The story goes that he grieved in ways he rarely showed the world, and that the house on the Palatine was quieter for years afterward. And so Tiberius came back not merely as a returning stepson, not merely as a rehabilitated exile, but as something the court had been reluctantly calculating toward for some time, the most qualified man remaining, the one with the campaigns behind him, the one who had governed provinces and commanded legions, and had, despite everything, despite the years away and the disgrace they carried, never actually failed at any task he had been given. Augustus was a man who understood what was useful, and Tiberius, whatever the complications between them, was useful. More than useful. he may have been in the end the only real option. The adoption came in the year that we would call 4 after the birth of Christ. It was a formal thing, a legal ceremony in the Roman manner, conducted with the proper witnesses and the proper words, and it made Tiberius Claudius Nero into Tiberius Julius Caesar, a son of the House of Augustus, an heir to everything the Principate meant and implied and required. He was at this point in his middle 40s, already marked by the campaigns, by Rhodes, by the slow accumulation of a life lived mostly in service to things larger than himself. He received the adoption with the same grave quietness he brought to most things. Whatever he felt about it, relief, ambivalence, a complicated pride, the strange weight of being chosen when one has long believed oneself discarded. The old sources do not tell us directly, and we should probably not guess too confidently. What we do know is that he returned to work immediately and thoroughly. There were campaigns waiting. The northern frontier, which we will follow more closely in the chapter to come, was a place of ongoing Roman concern, and Tiberius took up that work with the discipline he had always brought to soldiering, methodically, without drama, reading the terrain and the politics of the tribal confederacies with eyes that were older and perhaps wiser than they had been before Rhodes. He had always been a capable general. He was now a careful one in the deepest sense, taking nothing for granted, trusting the slow accumulation of preparation over the quick brilliance of improvisation. There is something to notice in how Tiberius moved through these years of his return, the years between coming back to Rome and the death of Augustus that would make him emperor. He did not play the court. He did not gather factions around him, or cultivate the affectionate display that Germanicus, his nephew, seemed to manage so effortlessly, that particular warmth that makes soldiers cheer and crowds lean forward. Tiberius was not that kind of man and had perhaps long since stopped pretending to be. He was formal, a little remote, the kind of person whose approval you felt as a steady, reliable thing, rather than a warm and shining one. Some found this difficult. Others, the ones who valued competence over charm, the old senatorial families who respected a man who read his briefs and gave precise answers, found it more than enough. He was in his late 40s when Augustus began to fail in the way that very old men fail, slowly and then with a kind of gathering momentum. The emperor had outlasted almost everyone who had known him in the years of the civil wars, had outlasted enemies and rivals and beloved grandchildren, and had become something so woven into the fabric of Roman life that people who had been born after the battles of Actium had never known a world without him. He had been the sun that everything else organized itself around, and Tiberius had grown up in that light, had been warmed by it and burned by it, and cast in and out of its favor over the long decades. And now it was dimming. Augustus died, the histories tell us, in Nola in the south, in the month of August in the year 37 after the death of Christ has been counted back from. And Tiberius was with him, or came to him in time. The accounts differ slightly, and we hold the uncertainty gently. What is certain is that the world changed in those quiet hours, the way a room changes when a lamp goes out, not with any dramatic gesture, but with a sudden awareness of how much light there had been and how differently things look by different illumination. The empire was there, the frontier was there, the Senate was there, and the legions, and the grain supply, and the correspondence that never stopped arriving no matter what had just happened in the world. Tiberius had returned from Rhodes a patient man, and patience would be what he needed now more than anything else in the long and careful work that was beginning. Tonight, let the sea carry you towards sleep. That same sea that washed the shores of Rhodes all those years, that same water that bore him home across its wide and unhurried surface. Tomorrow we will follow him north, into the cold and the pine forests and the sound of rivers running fast over dark stones, into the work of the frontier that was always, for Tiberius, a place where the world made a kind of sense it rarely made elsewhere. The fire in the camp brazier burned low before dawn, casting its amber wash across the leather walls of a command tent somewhere beyond the Rhine, and if you had been standing there in the gray pre-light, you might have heard nothing at all for a long moment, only the slow breath of the river behind you, and the wind moving through the oak forests ahead, and the particular silence that a great army makes when it is sleeping and does not yet know what the day will ask of it. This was the world Tiberius had returned to. The cold world, the honest world as he thought of it, where a man's worth was measured not in whispered words at court, but in the steadiness of his hands on a cold morning, and the loyalty of the men who followed him into the dark between the trees. He had come back from Rhodes changed, as we have already drifted to together, quieter, more inward, the sharp edges of his younger ambitions worn smooth by years of deliberate solitude. But the army still knew him, the legions remembered, and Rome, wounded and humiliated by the catastrophe in the Teutoburg forest, needed someone the soldiers would follow without question into that same darkness that had swallowed 3 legions whole not so many years before. It is worth resting a moment on what that catastrophe had meant, for it lay over everything that Tiberius did in these years like a long, cold shadow. In the 9th year of the Common Era, the general Publius Quinctilius Verus had led 3 full Roman legions, something close to 20,000 soldiers, with their attendants, their families, their supply trains, into the forests of Germania, following a guide who knew exactly where he was taking them. That guide was Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had served in the Roman army long enough to learn everything Rome knew about how to destroy itself, and the ambush he laid in the hills and bogs and narrow defiles of what the Romans called the Teutoburg forest was patient and total and merciless. Verus, seeing no way out, fell upon his own sword. The eagle standards of 3 legions, those gilded symbols that a Roman soldier was expected to die defending, were captured and carried away into the forest. Augustus, it is said, shut himself in his room for days, refusing to cut his hair, crying out in grief that Verus had given him back his legions. Rome never truly forgot that wound, and so when Tiberius crossed the Rhine in the years that followed, he crossed it not merely as a general pursuing military objectives, but as a man charged with restoring something that had been broken in the Roman imagination. He did this characteristically, without flourish. He moved methodically. He rebuilt the discipline that fear and recent disaster had loosened in the frontier legions, drilling them through the gray autumn mornings with that same patient insistence on precision that had always defined his generalship. He had never been the kind of commander who inspired men with beautiful speeches or grand gestures. He was the kind who was simply there, walking the same mud, eating the same bread, sharing the same cold. His soldiers trusted him the way they trusted a road that had been walked many times before, not because it was beautiful, but because it had never yet disappeared beneath their feet. And alongside him in these years was Germanicus. Here the story requires a gentle honesty, because the relationship between Tiberius and his nephew was never a simple one, and even in these years of shared campaigning, it carried within it the seeds of a tension that would grow more complicated later. Germanicus was the son of Tiberius's own brother Drusus, who had died young on campaign, and whose memory Rome had wrapped in a kind of golden grief. Germanicus had inherited something of that glow. He was charming where Tiberius was reserved, generous where Tiberius was careful, beloved by the troops in the open and demonstrative way that Tiberius had never quite managed, and one's senses had never quite pursued. When Augustus had arranged the succession, he had made Tiberius adopt Germanicus as his own son and heir, which meant that the 2 men now stood in an arrangement that was legally that of father and son, but was in feeling something more like 2 differently shaped pieces of the same complex machine. What is certain is that they campaigned together, and that their campaigns pushed Roman arms back into the territories east of the Rhine with a force and organization that slowly, steadily reasserted the presence that Teutoburg had shattered. Germanicus, it must be said, was brave almost to the point of recklessness, a quality the troops adored, and that Tiberius, the patient calculator of risks, watched with what one imagines was a complicated mixture of admiration and quiet apprehension. Germanicus led from the front with an energy that seemed sometimes almost theatrical, as if he understood that his troops needed to see him and to believe in the story he embodied. Tiberius led from the center of a system, a web of supply lines, engineering works, careful fortifications, and the slow accumulation of advantages that he had been building and maintaining since his first command in Armenia all those decades before. Together, they were more effective than either alone might have been. The Germanic tribes felt the pressure of coordinated Roman force applied over seasons and years, not in single brilliant strokes, but in the steady, grinding way that Rome at its best had always projected its power. not as a wave that crashes and recedes, but as a tide that simply rises and does not fall. The landscape through which they moved was nothing like Italy. Even in the relatively settled zones behind the Rhine, the land felt different, older somehow, less ordered, the forests coming down closer to the roads, the light more diffuse through the constant gray and green canopy above. The soldiers from the south, from Hispania and North Africa and the warm plains of Italy, found the north strange and heavy, the darkness of the forest pressing against the edges of their camps at night with a weight that felt almost personal. Roman soldiers were superstitious men, as soldiers in all ages tend to be, and after Teutoburg, the Germanic forest had acquired a quality that went beyond simple military threat. It had become a place where Rome had been taught that it was not invincible, and that lesson sat uneasily in men who had been raised on the assumption of Roman permanence. Tiberius moved through this landscape with his characteristic self-containment, neither inflaming the fears of his men nor dismissing them, simply asking them to do the next necessary thing and then the next, and finding that they could. This is, when you let yourself feel it, a remarkable thing about him, this ability to ask not for enthusiasm, but for endurance, and to find that endurance is, in the end, the more durable quality. The campaigns achieved what Rome needed them to achieve, though not the spectacular revenge that some had hungered for. The eagle standards lost at Teutoburg were not all recovered in these years. That particular consolation came later, piece by piece, through diplomacy as much as force. But the frontier was made functional again, the legions were made reliable again, and the long Rhine line was established as the boundary that Rome would largely maintain for centuries. It was not a glorious outcome in the way that a triumph in the Forum was glorious. It was the quieter glory of a thing that held. Germanicus would later return to Germania after Tiberius's attention was required elsewhere, and he would pursue the war with that characteristic energy of his, reaching even the site of the Teutoburg disaster, and burying what bones still remained there among the trees, a gesture that the sources describe with a kind of reverence, as if Rome had finally been allowed to grieve. Tiberius, watching from a greater distance, appears to have felt that some of Germanicus's later campaigning stretched beyond what could be securely held, and he recalled him to Rome before the ambitions of the expedition could outrun its foundations. This was not, as some said at the time, jealousy, or if it was inseparable from genuine military judgment, and the two are difficult to separate in a man whose inner life was always so carefully kept from public view. What is left, when you let the campaigns settle and the names of the rivers and the tribal confederations grow quiet, is an image of a man growing older in the cold air of the frontier, doing work he understood and trusted, building and maintaining and holding. It was the kind of life he had always been better suited for than the marble corridors and whispered politics of Rome. And somewhere in the back of his thoughts, you imagine, he must have known that the corridors were waiting for him. For Augustus was aging, back in Rome, in his quiet house on the Palatine Hill. The lamps that burned there burned more carefully now, tended by hands that had learned long ago not to let any light go out before its time. And the question of what came after had begun, at last, to ask itself aloud. The lamps were still burning when the news arrived from Nola. It was deep summer, the kind of summer that settles over the Italian countryside like a warm cloth laid gently across a sleeping face, the air thick with the smell of dry grass and stone, warmed through many hours by a sun that had only recently descended behind the hills. The year was 14 years after the birth of Christ, and the man who had shaped the known world, who had given his name to a month and his image to 1,000 coins, who had stood at the center of Roman life for so long that many living Romans could not remember a time before him. That man was gone. Augustus Caesar had died at Nola, it is said in the arms of his wife Livia, having spoken his last words with the composure of an actor who knows his final scene, asking those gathered around him whether he had played his part in the comedy of life with sufficient skill. And then the breath that had directed the fate of nations simply ceased, and the room grew still, and outside the window the summer evening continued exactly as it had before, indifferent and warm, and full of the sound of insects in the grass. The news traveled as news always traveled in those days, on horseback through the long roads of Italy, carried by riders who switched horses at posting stations and ate their bread in the saddle and did not stop for the ordinary courtesies of the road. And when it reached Tiberius, who was traveling in Campania at the time, some accounts suggest he may have been with Augustus himself in those final days, though the exact details are softened by the passage of so many centuries. Something in the world shifted, quietly and irrevocably, the way a great stone shifts when the ground beneath it finally settles. He was 55 years old, a man of late middle age, thick through the chest and shoulders from decades of soldiering, his face lined by weather and by long private thought, his hair gone to silver and his manner gone to a kind of careful stillness that those who did not know him often mistook for coldness. He had spent his life being shaped by forces larger than himself, by the civil wars that drove his family into exile when he was a small child, by the will of Augustus who had taken him into the imperial household and then sent him away and brought him back and used him, as great men use capable men, as an instrument of policy. He had been a general, a diplomat, a stepson, a husband twice over and happy only once, an exile by his own choosing, and for the last 4 years since his return to Rome, the heir, the designated successor to the most powerful position in the world. And yet when that position was at last his to take, what followed, in the Senate House, in the weeks after Augustus died, is one of the more remarkable passages in all of Roman history. A series of strange and uncertain sessions, in which Tiberius, who was already in practical terms the most powerful man in the Roman world, repeatedly declined to say plainly that he wished to be emperor. He spoke in long, careful sentences that seemed always to circle away from the direct claim of power. He spoke of the burden of governing so vast an empire, of the need for many hands to share so heavy a weight, of his own age and weariness. He invited the Senate to take a larger role. He asked, with what appeared to be genuine uncertainty, whether they might consider dividing the responsibilities of the Principate among several men. The senators, many of whom had spent their careers learning to read the moods of powerful men and agree with them, found themselves baffled. They did not know whether this was a test, a performance, or something stranger and more sincere. And here the ancient writers differ, as ancient writers so often do, in how they interpret what they saw. Tacitus, writing nearly a century later with his characteristic cool suspicion, believed that the hesitation was largely theatrical, that Tiberius wished to be seen to be reluctant so that his eventual acceptance would appear a sacrifice made for Rome rather than an ambition satisfied. Others have read it differently. There is something in the consistency of Tiberius's behavior across his whole life, his retreat to Rhodes, his genuine distaste for flattery, his repeated and sincere-seeming expressions of discomfort with the ceremonies of power, that suggests the hesitation in those Senate sessions may not have been entirely a performance. A man who truly wanted nothing more than power does not spend 7 years on an island studying philosophy with Greek scholars. A man who craved the Principate as pure ambition does not spend the first days of his reign asking senators to take on more responsibility. It is possible, and the story goes in the quieter readings of his character, that Tiberius was simply honest, that he saw the weight of what Augustus had carried and felt no pleasure at the thought of lifting it onto his own shoulders. That he was a man who had learned discipline and duty so thoroughly that he would do what was required of him, but that he would not pretend to enjoy the requiring. In the end, the Senate wore him down with their own anxious pressing, their urgent, slightly desperate insistence that he, and only he, was capable of holding the empire together, and Tiberius accepted. He is said to have remarked, with a bleakness that sounds entirely like him, that they were granting him the mastery of a wretched and burdensome slavery. It was not the declaration of a triumphant man, and then having accepted, he governed. And here the record becomes genuinely admirable, at least in those early years, when the full story of his reign was still being written, and the shadow that would later fall across it had not yet gathered. He governed with the careful, methodical attention of a man who had watched Augustus build something out of the wreckage of a century of civil war and understood how fragile that something still was. He was not extravagant. Where Augustus had been generous with public entertainments and building projects, Tiberius was restrained, almost deliberately unglamorous, as if luxury offended some deep puritanical strand in him. He kept the treasury sound. He answered the letters of provincial governors with detailed, considered replies. He told the Senate, again and again, that they should exercise their own judgment, that he expected them to function as the governing body of a republic, that he did not wish to be treated as a god or a monarch, but as a servant of the Roman people and the Roman state. The Senate, shaped by generations of autocracy and conditioned to look for what a powerful man wanted to hear, rather than what he actually said, mostly did not believe him. They continued to flatter. He continued to be irritated by the flattery. There was something almost comic in this mismatch. The emperor urging the senators to act like free men, and the senators looking nervously at one another and waiting to be told what he really meant. But the provinces were well administered, the roads were maintained, the legions were paid and supplied. Justice in those years moved through its channels with something approaching regularity. The historians who came after Tiberius, writing from the perspective of his later reign when things had grown darker, still acknowledge that these early years were years of sound and serious governance, that whatever else may be said of him, Tiberius in his first years as emperor took the work of empire seriously in a way that neither vanity nor cruelty had yet distorted. He was not loved. He had never been the kind of man who inspired love easily, having always kept something of himself behind a careful distance, as if warmth was a thing he offered only in private, and only to those he had decided slowly and deliberately to trust. The Roman people who had adored the easy charm of Augustus found in Tiberius something less comfortable, a ruler who would not perform for them, who watched gladiatorial games without particular enthusiasm, who seemed always to be thinking about something else. But the lamps burned steadily in the public buildings of Rome, the grain came in, the borders held, and in the evenings when the city settled into its particular night music of distant voices and the cry of night birds over the Tiber, and the soft movement of oil in 10,000 lamps flickering against 10,000 walls, there was something that might, in those years, be called order, not joyful, not celebrated, but present and solid and real. Tomorrow, in the quiet that follows sleep, we might wander a little further into those early years of his reign, into the daily textures of how the empire ran, into the careful correspondence and the patient administration that marked the time before the shadows gathered and the long story of his principate began to turn. But that is a gentle journey ahead. For now, the lamps of Rome burn quietly on. Somewhere in the city, before the first light has fully settled into the streets, a lamp is already burning. It sits on a plain wooden table in a room that smells of papyrus and old stone, and the man who lit it has been awake for some time already, reading correspondence from the eastern provinces, from the army on the Rhine, from magistrates in small towns whose names most Romans would struggle to place on a map. He reads carefully, as he does everything. He makes notes in a hand that is, by all accounts, neat and unhurried. He does not rush. He has never been a man who rushes, and now that the weight of the entire Roman world has settled onto his shoulders, the deliberateness that once seemed like coldness begins to look, to those who pay close attention, rather more like care. This is Tiberius in the early years of his reign, and those years, though history would eventually learn to overshadow them with darker things, were in many respects years of quiet, conscientious, genuinely competent rule. It is worth settling into them, the way you settle into a chair at the end of a long day, allowing the weight to leave your limbs. It is worth letting the room grow still, and breathing in what those years actually were, before everything else came after. He had taken the principate with reluctance, as we have already seen, and that reluctance never fully left him. But there is a quality in certain people, where the thing they did not want becomes the thing they do most dutifully, as though the very absence of ambition frees them to serve without performance. Tiberius had watched Augustus perform for decades. He had seen the calculated warmth, the managed appearances, the theater of republican restoration that kept the peace even as one man quietly held all the real power. He did not wish to perform. He was not built for it, and he knew it. And so, in his own way, in the early years at least, he governed differently, more plainly, more honestly, and in some senses more effectively than anyone might have predicted. He answered letters. This alone distinguished him in ways that the ancient writers noted with something approaching surprise, as if a conscientious emperor were a novelty, which perhaps, given the precedence, it slightly was. Governors who wrote to him with questions received considered replies. Cities that petitioned for relief from taxation after floods or earthquakes found their cases examined seriously and often resolved in their favor. The bureaucracy of the empire, vast and slow-moving as it was, found at its head a man who actually read what was placed before him, who did not wave things aside, who had spent enough time in the provinces and on the frontiers to understand that the empire was not only Rome, that it was also a small town in Dalmatia with a broken aqueduct, a garrison on the upper Rhine waiting on its winter supplies, a harbor master in Alexandria whose authority had been disputed by a new magistrate with different ideas about his own importance. He was careful with money, unusually so. Augustus had been generous, lavishly and calculatingly generous, scattering gifts and games and grain distributions through the city, like a man who understood that spectacle was its own kind of governance. Tiberius did not share this instinct. He believed, the ancient sources suggest, that the treasury existed to fund the empire and not to fund the enthusiasm of the crowd, and he was right in the way that honest accountants are often right and rarely thanked for it. He did not abolish generosity, but he measured it. The grain supply was maintained. The legions were paid. The public buildings kept in repair. And by the time the early years of his reign had settled into something like a rhythm, the treasury had grown considerably fuller than it had been under the great spender who preceded him. The Senate he treated, in those early years, with a respect that was genuine, even when it was also complicated. He believed in the institution, or had been trained to believe in it, or perhaps both, and the distinction between belief and training is one that grows harder to make the longer you live under any particular arrangement of the world. He brought real questions before them. He asked for their opinions. He insisted, sometimes to the point of irritation, that they exercise actual judgment rather than simply waiting to hear what he wished them to say and then applauding. There is a quality of irony in this, because the Senate of his day had, over the long decades of Augustus's reign, largely forgotten how to do anything else. And a body asked to be genuinely deliberative after years of careful theater finds the task awkward, like a muscle long unused. But the wish, at least, was real. The effort was real. And historians who have looked closely at those early years have found, beneath the later reputation for tyranny, a period of administration that a good many emperors might have envied. He did not spend much time on the Palatine if he could help it. The palace, such as it was in those days, still growing and accumulating its future grandeur, did not suit him. He preferred to be at his work, to be reading and dictating and conferring, to be in rooms that smelled of ink and not of ceremony. He walked in the early mornings, it is said, along the quieter streets of the city, moving through the hours before the crowds thickened, when the bread sellers were just beginning to open their shutters, and the smell of warm grain drifted through the alleys, and the light was the soft, uncertain gold of a sun that has not yet committed to the day. He was not loved, not in the way that Augustus had been loved, not in the way that Germanicus, his nephew, brilliant and charming and heartbreakingly young, was loved. Tiberius had never learned the art of being loved, had perhaps decided early that it was not available to him, and had rerouted his energies accordingly. But he was, in those good early years, respected. By the serious men, the careful administrators, the officers who valued competence over warmth, there was a recognition that this cold, deliberate, sometimes difficult emperor was doing something real, something useful, something that held the enormous and complicated structure of the Roman world together, with more skill than it sometimes got credit for. The relay of horses and riders that carried the empire's communications from one end of the world to the other, from Cappadocia to the Rhine, from the ports of Africa to the mountains of Spain. Each letter was, in its way, a lamp held up against the dark, a decision made, a problem addressed, a distance closed by the careful movement of a reed across papyrus. He governed by attention, which is to say, he governed by the sustained and serious direction of a mind that had been formed in discipline and sharpened on long years of waiting, and the empire, for a time, was the better for it. Outside the window of whatever room he occupied, Rome went on being Rome. The city heaved and breathed and smelled of bakeries and drains, of incense from the temples on the hill, of wool drying in the winter wind. The fountains ran, fed by the great aqueducts that came striding in on their stone legs from the hills beyond the city, carrying their cold, clean water into the streets and into the marble basins where it arrived with a sound like quiet and steady patience, as if water had always known how to wait for the moment it was needed, and had simply kept moving, all the same. These were the good years, and they deserved their name. Not perfect years, not unclouded years, for Tiberius was never a man around whom clouds entirely dispersed, but years in which the machinery of Roman government worked, in which the emperor at his lamplit table was genuinely trying to do what he had been given to do. Years in which the city and the empire moved forward in something close to stability and something not entirely unlike peace. And then as the lamplight burns a little lower and the night deepens around us, we can feel something beginning to gather at the edge of the story, not yet present, not yet demanding attention, but there the way a distant weather change is there before you can name it. A man is rising, patient and clever, in the corridors not far from the emperor's plain table, a shadow that has not yet resolved into a shape. But that is for another night, another chapter, another slow settling into the dark. For now the lamp on the table burns steadily, the city breathes below the 7 hills, and the water in the fountains moves through the Roman night with the sound of something that will keep on flowing long after all the emperors have passed. The lamps of Rome burned on through the night, as they always had, as they perhaps always would, their small flames steady in the windless hours before dawn, casting the same warm amber light across marble and plaster and worn stone that they had cast across every reign, every conspiracy, every quiet turning of the world's great wheel. And in those years when Tiberius had settled into the slow rhythms of governance, when the empire seemed for a little while to run as smoothly as a river in summer, there was a man who understood lamplight very well, who understood, that is, how to stand within it, and how to arrange that others should stand within it too, and how to choose with great patience and great care which shadows fell where. His name was Lucius alias Sejanus, and he was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. It is worth resting with that title for a moment, letting it settle, the way a stone settles into still water, sending out its quiet rings. The Praetorian Guard were the soldiers who protected the emperor. 9 cohorts, it is said, of elite troops, men who had been drawn from across Italy, chosen for their bearing and their loyalty, stationed now in a great consolidated barracks on the northeastern edge of the city. This consolidation had been Sejanus's own doing, arranged early in Tiberius's reign with smooth administrative logic, presented as a matter of efficiency and discipline, and it was both of those things, and it was also something else entirely, a drawing together of armed men into a single place, under a single commander, close enough to the heart of the city that their presence could be felt without being announced. Sejanus had come from the equestrian class, from a family of capable and ambitious men in Etruria, and he had risen through careful service and a quality that those who watched him found difficult to name precisely. It was not charm exactly, though he could deploy charm as easily as he deployed everything else. It was something more like attentiveness, a quality of listening, of noticing, of understanding what a man needed to hear, and providing it at the precise moment when the need was greatest. Tiberius, who had spent years on Rhodes, reading philosophy and studying the faces of people who did not know they were being studied, was not by nature an easy man to flatter. He was wary of flattery the way a man who has crossed bad ice is wary of any ice thereafter. And yet Sejanus found the narrow path through that wariness, not by offering empty praise, but by offering something that felt, at least in those early years, like genuine usefulness. He was efficient. He managed the details of the guard, of communications, of the 100 small administrative necessities that surrounded the person of the emperor, with a quietness and a thoroughness that allowed Tiberius to think about larger things. He seemed to share the emperor's own disdain for the performative, the theatrical, the false warmth of the court. He arrived when summoned, spoke plainly, solved problems, and left. And Tiberius, who had lived so long at a remove from easy companionship, who had learned in Rhodes and in the German campaigns and in the long years of waiting to rely only upon himself, found in this useful, attentive, apparently trustworthy man something that he had perhaps learned to stop expecting from the world, a kind of reliable presence. The influence grew slowly. This is the nature of such things. They do not arrive as a sudden cold wind, but as a gradual shift in the air, imperceptible from one day to the next, only visible when you turn and look back at where you began and find that you are somewhere else entirely. Sejanus began to manage access to the emperor. This was a natural function of his role. The prefect's men guarded the imperial person, and it followed that the prefect himself would have some say in who approached and when. But the circle of those who moved freely in the imperial presence began, almost without anyone remarking upon it at first, to narrow and to shift, so that those who had been closest to Tiberius found the path a little longer, the waiting a little more uncertain, and those who had found favor with Sejanus discovered that their own access had become, quietly, easier. In the Senate, Sejanus had allies, men who understood which way the wind was turning and had made the sensible calculation. In the streets, or so the story goes, his image appeared in public places alongside the emperor's, a thing that would have been unthinkable for any private citizen, any man not of the imperial family, and yet it happened, and Tiberius either approved it or did not prevent it, and the distinction between those two things was perhaps becoming harder to see clearly. Letters arrived on Tiberius's desk, filtered through hands that Sejanus controlled. Appointments to provincial governorships, to military commands, to the profitable and powerful positions that kept the empire turning, were made with increasing reference to the prefect's opinion, his knowledge, his careful and detailed assessments of which men were trustworthy and which were not. It is said that he harbored ambitions that went further still, ambitions that touched upon the succession itself, upon the possibility of a future in which the power that was currently exercised in an emperor's name might one day be exercised in one's own. Whether this is true, whether Sejanus dreamed in those particular terms, is difficult to say with certainty across the distance of so many centuries. What the historical record does preserve is the outline of actions, the pursuit of a marriage alliance with the imperial family, the careful management of information flowing to and from the emperor, and the treatment of those who stood between Sejanus and the proximity he sought. There were figures who suffered in these years, members of the imperial household and their friends and associates, people touched by accusations that arrived with the particular neatness of accusations that have been shaped rather than discovered. The law of treason, the lex majestatis, which had existed in various forms under the Republic and which Tiberius had allowed to be applied with increasing frequency in his reign, became in these years something that hung in the air of Rome, the way wood smoke hangs in the air of a city in winter, not everywhere at once, not suffocating, but present and impossible to entirely ignore. To say the wrong thing, to be connected to the wrong person, to find oneself named in a document that arrived from a well-placed source, was to discover how quickly the warm, comfortable world of Roman social life could become something cold and uncertain. The city sensed something, the way cities do, not through any single perception, but through the accumulated weight of small observations. A senator who had been visible and confident growing quiet, a friendship discreetly distanced, a dinner invitation declined, a conversation in the forum conducted in a lower register than it once would have been. The lamps still burned in the taverns and in the houses of the wealthy and in the temples on their hills, and the markets still opened each morning with their familiar noise and their familiar smells of bread and fish and the river. And on the surface very little had changed. But surfaces are where we spend our lives, and the surface of Rome was shifting, subtly, like the surface of water when something moves beneath it that cannot quite be seen. Tiberius himself seems to have trusted Sejanus with a degree of confidence that went beyond the merely professional, or at least to have allowed the appearance of such trust to persist, which in the complex grammar of imperial power amounts to very nearly the same thing. He called him, it is recorded, the partner of his labors, socius laborum, words that would have carried weight to Roman ears, words that suggested a closeness, a sharing of burdens, that was unusual to extend to a man not of the blood. Whether the emperor saw clearly what was accumulating around him, whether he chose not to see, whether he was deceived, or whether some more intricate combination of all three things was at work in that guarded and watchful mind, this is one of the questions that history poses and does not answer cleanly, and perhaps the honest thing is simply to hold the question gently, as one holds something fragile, without pressing too hard. What can be said is that in those years, Rome breathed a little more carefully than it once had, and the lamplight in the city's great houses fell on faces that had learned, whatever their private thoughts, the old and useful art of composing themselves before they spoke. Let that image rest with you for a while, those lit windows, those careful faces, that city carrying on beneath its quiet unease, as cities always do, with the oil lamps burning through another long Roman night. In the chapters that lie just ahead, we will follow Tiberius as he moves further still from the city and its pressures, out to the sea and the cliffs and the high terraced gardens of Capri, where the sound of the water was never quite absent, and where in time, even the long shadow of Sejanus would at last fall short of reaching him. The water finds the island before anything else does, long before the boat comes close enough to see the pale limestone cliffs or the dark fringe of vegetation that crowns them. You can already sense that Capri exists in a different relationship with the world than the mainland does, that it sits apart from things not merely by the accident of geography, but by something older, some quality of light that gathers here and slows down, some quality of silence that the sea maintains around its edges, like a kept promise. The Tyrrhenian stretches out on every side in the colors of early morning, that particular shifting blue that moves between slate and silver and the faintest suggestion of green depending on where a cloud passes overhead. And the water catches and releases the light with the easy patience of something that has been doing exactly this for longer than memory reaches. It was in the year that we count as the 26th after the birth of Christ, when Tiberius had already been emperor for more than a decade, that he came to Capri for what would prove to be the last time, came and remained, and did not leave again for the rest of his life, which would stretch across another 11 years of solitary cliff-top governance. He had visited the island before, had known its particular gentleness since the days when Augustus was still alive, and had loved the place, had walked its narrow paths and breathed its herb-scented air during earlier periods when Rome had pressed too hard against him. But this final departure from the city, this crossing of the narrow channel between Misenum and the island, was different in kind from anything that had come before, and those who watched him go seemed to have understood, in whatever wordless way such things are understood, that this was not a visit. He was 67 years old. His body still carried itself with the large, solid dignity that had marked him since youth, though the years had settled into it in ways that were visible if you knew where to look. A certain careful economy of movement, a preference for shade in the afternoon, the way a man holds himself when the morning stiffness in his joints has become something he no longer finds surprising. His face, which had always been long and composed and difficult to read with confidence, had grown more so with time, the expressions resting within it growing quieter and more internal, the way a lamp that once threw light across a whole room can eventually become something you only notice when you stand quite close to it. The island received him without ceremony, which was, in its way, precisely the ceremony he required. Capri in those years was a place of unusual layered beauty, the kind that does not announce itself, but simply is, rocky and warm and scented and vertical, its cliffs dropping to the sea with an abruptness that has always made visitors catch their breath, and then shortly after, begin to breathe more slowly and deeply than they had before. The villas that sat along its heights had been built and expanded over years of imperial attention, and the largest and most elevated of them, the one that later memory would come to call the Villa Jovis, the House of Jupiter, occupied the northeastern cliff like something that had grown there rather than been constructed, its terraces and rooms arranged so that on every side the sea was visible. The Tyrrhenian spreading away south and west toward distances that the eye cannot fully compass, and to the north the long brown line of the Italian coast with Misenum and the bay beyond, and the familiar hills that were now simply the place the letters came from, and the place the letters went to. It was by letter, then, that an empire of some 40 million souls was governed from this cliff-top. The couriers came and went in boats, crossing the few miles of water that separated Capri from the mainland, carrying their sealed dispatches up the steep paths with the steady efficiency of men who have learned that their emperor reads everything and responds to much. Tiberius was not, even in these years, a man who had surrendered the practical work of rule. The correspondence that flowed from the villa, to the Senate, to provincial governors, to military commanders on the Rhine and the Euphrates and the borders of Africa, was careful and detailed, and often, by the accounts of those who received it, more thoroughly reasoned than documents produced by men surrounded by the full apparatus of the capital. He had always been a reader, always been a writer of considered prose, always found that his mind worked more clearly when external commotion was reduced to something manageable, and the island gave him that reduction in its most generous form. The Senate, it must be said, found the arrangement more difficult than the emperor did. To govern through letters is to govern through a medium that always arrives a little behind the moment it was written for. And those in Rome who needed decisions, who craved the physical presence of authority, who wanted to see the emperor's face when they spoke to him, and read what could be read there, experienced the island as a kind of vast, blue, light-drenched absence at the center of Roman public life. There were those who remembered the early years of the reign, when Tiberius had still been present in the Senate House, still attending to the daily textures of governance with the careful attention he had given everything, and the comparison between those years and these was not one that anyone could make without a certain unease settling in alongside it. Power exercised from a great distance acquires a different quality than power exercised in the room, not necessarily less power, but differently shaped, and the shape of it, to those on the receiving end, can feel both more absolute and less comprehensible. But Tiberius, walking in the afternoon on his terraced paths above the water, seems to have found in the distance something that felt to him less like withdrawal and more like clarity. He had never been comfortable in the performance that Roman public life demanded, the showing of face, the managing of appearances, the constant calibration of expression for the benefit of audiences who were always watching, always interpreting. He had endured it for years, had submitted to it as a kind of civic duty, not unlike the military campaigns of his youth, had given it what it required and received in return the accumulated strains of a man doing something that does not come naturally to him. Here, above the water, the performance was not required. He kept the company of scholars and astrologers, and men who liked to talk about ideas, without requiring anything of him beyond his attention. And his attention, when genuinely engaged, was still the intense and focused thing it had always been. It is said that he took particular pleasure in the island's small corners, the grottos near the water, where the sea came in over pale rock in movements that were almost silent, where the light reflected upward in moving patterns of blue and silver that changed with every gentle shift of the surface. He would sit in these places, by some accounts, for long periods, watching the water think its slow, perpetual thoughts. The villas held within them the objects of a life that had outlasted most of the people who had shared it. Books, sculptures, correspondence, the accumulated material residue of a man who had campaigned across half the known world and governed its largest empire, and lost in the process nearly every person for whom he had felt anything that could honestly be called warmth. Vipsania was gone, had been gone for years, had died as a private citizen in a quiet marriage that had never required her to be anything she was not. Augustus was gone. Most of the contemporaries who had known him as a young man, who had known him before he became a symbol rather than a person, had passed out of the world one by one, the way people do, leaving each time a small additional silence where they had been. The water below the cliffs did not mark these absences. It continued as it had always continued, catching the afternoon light and releasing it, moving in its long, slow patterns against the limestone, the same water that had surrounded this island since before anyone whose name we know had ever stood on these cliffs and looked down into it. And in the evenings, when the sun lowered itself toward the western sea, and the light went through its familiar sequence of gold and amber and the deep particular rose that the Mediterranean sky produces on calm nights, the villa settled into a quiet that was not emptiness, but something closer to its opposite, a fullness of stillness, the day's correspondence complete, the couriers already crossing back toward the mainland in their small boats, the water below taking on the darker colors of approaching night. It is a stillness worth resting in yourself, if you are willing. The next chapter will linger here a little longer, before anything is required of either of us, drifting through the gardens and the grottos, and the slow Aegean light of Capri, where the water keeps its gentle, endless vigil against the white stone. The sea reaches the island before anything else does. It arrives as sound first, a low, continuous breathing against the limestone cliffs below, rhythmic and unhurried. The kind of sound that has been here since long before any human hand dealt anything on these heights, and will go on long after the last stone has crumbled back into the hill. You can hear it now if you grow still enough. A slow exhale against rock. A pause. And then again, patient as sleep itself. The water returning to do what water has always done on this small, ancient island set into the blue heart of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Capri sits in the water, like something that has chosen to remain. It does not reach toward the mainland. which lies perhaps a dozen miles to the north, across a channel that can be glassy and mirror still in the early morning, or churned into long gray furrows when the winter winds come down from the north. But in the warm months, and there are many warm months here, the crossing is gentle enough that small boats make it in a matter of hours, their sails pale against the blue, their reflections riding beneath them like quiet companions. The island watches them come and go without urgency. It has seen a great many boats. On the eastern heights, above a series of natural terraces that look out across the water toward the distant smudge of the mainland, there is a villa so large that it might almost be called a small town. It sprawls across the clifftop in a series of connected rooms, colonnaded walkways, gardens, and open terraces, its walls the color of warm limestone in the afternoon light, its roofs of terracotta catching the last of the sun and holding it a little longer than the sky does. This is the Villa Jovis, the house of Jupiter, and it is here that the old emperor has made his world. Not a court exactly, though attendants and advisors and letter carriers come and go. Not a prison, though he cannot quite leave it now, in these later years. Something more like a perch, a high, quiet place from which a man might look out over the world he governs and feel perhaps the strange relief of distance. The gardens wake before the villa does, in the hour just before full light, when the sky above the eastern water is the color of pewter slowly warming toward gold. The terraced beds below the main colonnade are already alive with sound and movement, though gently so. Small birds move through the rosemary and lavender that grow in thick, silvery green mounds along the lower walls, their movements quick and purposeful, in a way that feels almost private, as though they know they have this hour to themselves. Dew sits on every flat surface, on the broad leaves of the fig trees that grow along the southern-facing walls, on the gray stones of the pathways, on the petals of roses that have been tended here since the villa was young. There is a smell to Capri in this hour that has no precise name, only sensation, the salt of the sea carried up on the night air, the cool green sharpness of the rosemary, something faintly mineral from the wet stone, and underneath all of it, very faint, the warm vegetable darkness of the soil that has been worked and watered and composted through many seasons of careful attention. The pathways between the garden beds are worn smooth by years of sandaled feet. Here, in the long, slow evenings, and sometimes in the very early mornings, the emperor walks. He moves without particular haste, and those who have described him in these years speak of a tall figure grown somewhat stooped, wrapped in a cloak, even when the night is not especially cold, pausing sometimes at the low wall at the terrace's edge to look out at the water below. It is said that he sometimes stood there for a very long time, quite still, watching the moonlight move on the surface of the sea, watching the distant lights of fishing boats making their slow way across the dark water. What he thought during these long stillnesses, no one recorded. Some things belong only to the person thinking them. Below the gardens, the cliff face drops away in great pale sweeps of limestone to the sea far beneath. There are places where the rock has been worn into grottos by centuries of patient water, and in the deeper hours of the night, these spaces fill with a sound that is not quite echo and not quite music. The complicated conversation of the sea and enclosed stone, amplified and softened and given back in forms slightly changed. Fishermen who have pulled their boats up on the narrow beaches below speak of hearing these grottos sing on still nights, a low harmonic sound that seems to come from inside the island itself. The story goes that the emperor sometimes had his attendants light lamps in the lower grottos when he wished to walk the cliff paths at night, and that the small flames reflected in the still water of the grotto pools made the place look briefly like a second sky set into the rock, a constellation of orange and gold trembling just beneath the surface. The light on Capri is particular to this place. In the full heat of the afternoon, it falls flat and white on the pale stone, bleaching color from everything it touches, making the terraces and walls look almost abstract, like forms sketched in chalk. But in the early morning and the late afternoon, it becomes something else entirely. It turns amber and oblique, casting long shadows from the smallest raised edge, making the texture of every stone visible, picking out the grain of the limestone and the weave of the linen awnings that hang above the shaded walkways. The sea below changes with it, moving through shades of blue and gray and green in the course of a single day, and if you watch it for long enough from the high terrace, it begins to seem less like a fixed thing and more like a slow process, always in some stage of becoming something slightly different from what it was. The household sounds of the villa settle into their own daily rhythm, as household sounds in any large building do. The muffled movement of feet on stone, the distant sound of water being poured in the bathing rooms, the low voices of secretaries moving through the covered walkways with their tablets and their correspondence, the Empire's daily business arriving in bundles from the mainland on the morning boats to be read and answered and dispatched again before the day is done. The work of governing does not stop because the governor has retreated to an island. If anything, it arrives more tangibly here, more textured. The letters and reports stacking up in the cool rooms where the administrative staff works through the heat of the day. The old emperor reads, it is said, with great thoroughness, even still. He signs. He dictates responses in a hand that has grown, over these years, somewhat slower, but no less precise. In the late afternoon, when the heat has begun to ease and the light has shifted into its amber register, the terraces come back to life. The birds that fell silent in the hottest hours return to the fig trees. The smell of something being prepared in the kitchen buildings drifts through the lower colonnades. Olive oil heated with herbs, the clean, sharp smell of vinegar, bread that has been baking since mid-morning in the deep stone ovens. There is a cat, or there may have been a cat. Some accounts are vague and some are charming, and sometimes these two things are the same, that has made its home among the warm stones of the South Terrace, appearing at mealtimes with the reliable optimism of its kind, and disappearing again into the warm complexity of the garden when it is not needed. The stars above Capri are clear in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not seen them from a high place above open water. There is no city light to soften them. They appear simply as themselves, enormous, immediate, close enough that the old myth about the sky being a dome with holes in it becomes briefly, surprisingly believable. The Milky Way stretches above the island in a river of faint light, so wide and so detailed that it seems almost architectural, as though someone has built something up there and left it lit. In the grottos below, if a lamp has been left burning, the reflection in the still water offers the night sky back again, inverted and softened and swaying very slightly with the breathing of the sea. And so the island holds its emperor, and the sea holds the island, and the darkness holds all of it gently, the way darkness does when it has nothing to prove. Rest here for a moment if you like. There is nothing pressing. The water goes on breathing below the cliffs, patient and slow, as it has always done, as it will do long into the night. Tomorrow there will be a letter. There is always a letter, and this one, when it arrives, will carry in it something that will change the quiet of Capri entirely, though for now that is still somewhere out on the dark water, not yet arrived, not yet opened, still sealed and silent in the hold of a boat, making its slow way across the channel toward morning. The sea was very quiet that morning off the cliffs of Capri, the water lying flat and pale beneath an autumn sky the color of old linen. And somewhere on the terraces above, an oil lamp had been burning since before the first light came, because the old man who lived there had not slept well, and had risen in the hours before dawn to sit with his thoughts and his letters, as he so often did now, in the way that very old and very careful men sometimes sit with a problem they have been turning over for longer than they would care to admit, feeling its edges in the dark, waiting to understand at last the shape of the thing they are holding. It was the year that we now number as 31 in the Common Era, and Tiberius had been emperor for 17 years, and for 5 of those years, more or less, the man named Lucius alias Sejanus had stood at the center of Roman life with a confidence that had grown, season by season, like a vine that begins as something decorative and ends by cracking the wall it climbs. The story of what happened next is one that ancient sources tell with a kind of breathless wonder, because it unfolded in a single day, in the space of a few daylight hours, in a city where everyone had come to believe that Sejanus was untouchable, that he was practically the second man in the world, that he was perhaps already something more than that, and then quite suddenly he was nothing at all, and Rome was left standing in the rubble of its own assumptions, blinking, uncertain what to believe or whom to trust. To understand the day, you must understand the years that led to it, and those years have their own slow wait. Tiberius had retreated to Capri in the year that we number as 26, and in his absence, Sejanus had grown into the space the emperor left behind, filling the corridors of the Palatine with his own people, surrounding the aging emperor on his island with those who reported to the prefect, managing the flow of information as a man manages a river, determining what reached the emperor and what was quietly redirected elsewhere. It is said that even some of Tiberius's own letters were seen first by the prefect's eyes before they went any further, though how completely this was true is difficult now to say with certainty. What is clear is that Sejanus had succeeded in isolating the emperor in ways that served his own ambitions, and that those ambitions had grown enormous, and that he had begun to plan, or so the accounts suggest, for something that went beyond mere influence. The precise nature of what Sejanus intended is something the ancient writers debate among themselves, and we need not resolve their argument tonight. What matters for our purposes is that Tiberius came to believe that his prefect was working against him, and that belief, once it had settled into that slow and careful mind, became a thing that the emperor would act upon, but act upon in his own way, in his own time, with the patience of a man who has learned through long and painful experience that haste undoes more than it accomplishes. What followed was an extraordinary piece of theater, a letter read aloud in the Senate on the 18th day of October in the year 31, a letter from the emperor himself, delivered by a man named Naevius Sutorius Macro, who was the man Tiberius had chosen to replace Sejanus, a replacement made quietly, secretly, in the way that Tiberius did most things that mattered to him. Sejanus came to the Senate that morning expecting, it is said, to receive some honor from the emperor, some further elevation, because Tiberius had been sending him encouraging signals in the weeks before, and the prefect had no reason, or thought he had no reason, to suspect that the letter waiting for him in that chamber was not what he expected. The letter began mildly enough by all accounts. It wandered, it discussed various matters, and then, gradually, like a tide coming in so slowly that you do not notice the water rising until it is already around your knees, it shifted, it turned toward criticism, it questioned, it accused, and by the time the words had run their course, Sejanus was a condemned man sitting in the chamber where, only moments before, he had been among the most powerful men alive. He was arrested before he could leave the building. He was executed before the day was out, along with a number of his closest associates and supporters, and the manner of his end, so sudden, so complete, so devastating in its swiftness, sent a tremor through the whole of Rome that people would feel for years afterward, a deep structural unease, as though the ground beneath the city had shifted slightly and would not quite settle back into its old position. The children of Sejanus were killed as well, including, the ancient writers record with something that reads like discomfort even across the centuries, a young daughter who was too young, in the strict technical sense of Roman law, to be executed in the customary manner, and so what was done to her was something that the historians set down carefully, and that we may allow to rest in the past undescribed, because some things from the ancient world are better acknowledged than repeated, and the lamp that burned that morning on Capri did not need to illuminate everything, in order to illuminate the essential truth of what those years had become. What is worth resting with instead is the image of Rome in the hours and days after the fall, the city trying to understand what had happened, trying to recalibrate, trying to determine who was safe and who was not, because the destruction of Sejanus did not end the fear that had settled over the capital during his years of influence. It only changed its shape. Before, people had feared the prefect. Now they feared the emperor, or they feared the emperor's agents, or they feared one another, because the informers who had served Sejanus did not simply vanish with their patron, and the habit of denunciation that had taken root in those years was not so easily uprooted. Tiberius himself, alone on his island, with the sea light moving across his walls, and the smell of the Tyrrhenian salt coming in through the open colonnades, received the news of the execution and the aftermath in the way he received most things now, in writing, at a distance that was geographic and also something deeper than geography. The ancient sources suggest that he was not at ease after the fall of Sejanus, that the discovery of how thoroughly the prefect had maneuvered around him, how completely he had been managed and enclosed without fully realizing it, left the emperor with a suspicion that did not diminish with the removal of its cause but rather spread outward, touching more and more faces, more and more names, The way it dies spreads through water and changes the color of everything it reaches. It is said, and the saying of it carries the weight of something that was widely felt at the time, that the years after 31 were harder than the years before, that the trials for treason grew more frequent, that the atmosphere in Rome took on a quality that people at the time described as oppressive, as a kind of permanent winter of the spirit, even when the season itself was warm and the city was outwardly as it had always been, its fountains running, its markets open, its hills golden in the late afternoon sun. But that is a story for the days ahead, and we need not go there tonight. Tonight we have rested long enough in the events of one autumn day, in the image of a letter read aloud in a marble hall, while a man's life collapsed around him, like a structure that had been hollow at its center from the beginning. Let the Senate House grow quiet now. Let the torches that burned there through that long October day gutter down and go dark. Let the streets of Rome fall into the stillness of a night that follows a day too strange and too large to be easily absorbed. The city breathing slowly in the dark, the hills standing as they have always stood, and somewhere across the water, an oil lamp on a cliff top still burning, still casting its small warm circle of light against the dark, the way it always does, the way it will go on doing through whatever the days ahead may bring, patient and steady above the murmuring sea. The sea breathes tonight, as it always has, indifferent and steady, pushing its long, slow swells against the rocks below Capri and against every other shore of the Mediterranean world, from the cold gray Atlantic edges of Hispania to the warm shallows of Alexandria's harbor, from the tidal flats of Britain to the silted mouths of the Nile, the same salt water moving through the same dark hours, carrying the same patient sound it carried when Rome was young, and when Tiberius was young, and when everything that has since grown old was still green and uncertain and full of possibility. But by the time we find him now, in those last years that historians would later call his Long Twilight, the green things are mostly gone. Tiberius is in his 70s, an age few Romans reached at all, and the body that had once carried a soldier across the Rhine and up through the passes of Armenia is slower now, heavier, creased with the particular weariness of a man who has outlived almost everything he valued. His face, it is said, was marked with sores and eruptions that he was known to conceal with bandages, or to turn away from visitors, preferring the wide open air of the island's heights to any enclosed room where eyes might linger too long. He walked still, alone or with a single attendant, along the cliff paths above the sea, and the sea wind moved through whatever remained of his white hair, and the water below caught the light of whatever stars were showing, and the empire continued, letter by letter, from those cliff-top rooms. The years after Sejanus's fall did not bring the relief one might have hoped. If anything, they deepened a darkness that had been gathering for a long time. The mechanism of accusation that Sejanus had helped to build did not dissolve with its architect. It had developed its own appetite, its own momentum, and Rome had by now a class of men who understood that there was profit in denunciation, that a well-placed word about a senator's dinner conversation, or a poet's unfortunate metaphor, could bring rewards, could level rivals, could fill an informer's purse with the confiscated estates of the condemned. Tiberius, isolated on Capri, could not see the texture of this from close up. What reached him were documents, reports, summaries, the thin papyrus filtration of a vast city sphere, and it is said that in those years he signed things he might once have questioned, approved proceedings he might once have slowed, because the machinery of government was now running largely without the friction of his direct attention. He wrote still, those long, careful letters, he answered petitions, he issued instructions about grain supply and provincial appointments, and the maintenance of roads. There was, underneath the darkness of the treason trials, a bureaucratic steadiness to these years that his more measured historians have noted with some care. Because the empire did not collapse, the frontiers did not fail, the grain did still arrive, the roads were kept, and the provinces were administered with a competence that owed something to the structures Tiberius himself had built in the earlier years of his reign. But competence administered from a distance, through fear, is a cold kind of governance, and the Senate that once received his respectful letters now received them with a different feeling entirely, parsing each word for threat, wondering what the old man on the island truly meant, what he was watching, what he knew. He did not return to Rome, Not once in those final years did he cross back from the island to the city he had ruled for 2 decades. He came close, it is said, on at least 2 occasions, approaching to within a few miles of the city walls, close enough that people gathered to see him, and then turned back, something in him unwilling or unable to complete the crossing. Perhaps Rome itself had become too dense with memory, too crowded with ghosts of people he had loved and lost and outlived. Vipsania, who had been taken from him in the old cruelty of political marriage. Germanicus, who had died young and bright and full of promise in the east. Drusus, his son, gone too, and before that his brother, and before that his mother Livia, that formidable and complicated woman whose long shadow had fallen across his entire life. Rome held all of them, their houses, their streets, the places where he had stood with them and would never stand again. Capri at least was free of all that. The sea had no memories. There is something in the ancient sources that historians approach with caution. A set of stories about the entertainments of Capri in these last years, whispered accounts of the old emperor's darker recreations, of grottos and rituals, and what is said to have happened in the villa's more private rooms. Some of these stories were written down by men who never visited the island, and who were writing decades after the events they described. And the tradition of blackening the reputation of dead emperors was already well established by the time they set their words to papyrus. It is difficult to know at this distance what is memory and what is malice. What can be said with more confidence is that he was old and tired and alone in the ways that matter, and that the island gave him what the city could not: distance and the sound of the sea, and mornings without ceremony. His health declined slowly, then less slowly, through the year 36 of the Common Era and into 37, that year when something was quietly ending, though Rome did not yet know it. He left Capri at last, not for the city, but moving along the coast toward the region around Misenum, that great naval promontory where the fleet was stationed, where the land curls into the bay, and the water is a particular shade of blue in the morning light, almost violet before the sun is fully up, deep and cold-looking even in spring. He reached the villa at Misenum, and it is there that the ancient accounts place his death in the month of March in the year 37, though the exact manner of that death was disputed even at the time, as the death of any emperor tends to be. The historian Tacitus records what some said, that he seemed to recover briefly from a serious illness, that there was a moment when his attendants believed he might rise again, and then he did not. Suetonius offers a darker version, suggesting the involvement of his eventual successor, Gaius, known to history as Caligula, who was present at Misenum in those days. But the darker versions carry that particular quality of stories that have passed through too many hands before being written down, and the quieter account, that an old man who had been slowly failing simply stopped, seems somehow more honest, more in keeping with the way things actually end. He was 77 years old, or thereabouts, which was a very great age for Rome, an age that took you back in memory almost to the days before Augustus had fully secured his power, back through all the changes and losses and long campaigns, and the cold roads of exile, and the years on Rhodes, and the marriages and the grief. 77 years of that particular Roman world, with its lamplight and its marble and its sea roads and its violence and its occasional genuine beauty. Rome received the news of his death, the ancient sources tell us, with something close to relief, or so it is said, and the crowds cheered and cried out things that do not bear repeating in the small hours of the night, because there is sadness enough in a life received so coldly at its end. Whatever he had been in those last withdrawn and fearful years, he had also been the boy who had run through the dark with his parents in the chaos of the civil wars, the young soldier who had crossed rivers in winter, the man who had wept when Vipsania was taken from him, the scholar who had walked the paths of Rhodes in the early morning, watching the sea between the olive trees. The water at Misenum would have sounded very much as it always does, that long hush and retreat across the stones, in and out, whether anyone is listening or not. The fleet rode at anchor in the bay as it had for years, the great ships quiet in the dark water, their lamp flames reflected in trembling lines on the surface below, each small flame doubled, one above and one below, breathing together in the movement of the tide. Somewhere in that same night, the world was already turning toward what would come next, and all of that still waits just ahead, held gently in the dark, patient as water, ready when you are. For now, let the water carry you, Let the lamp reflections tremble and settle, and allow yourself to rest. The fire has burned low now, and what remains of it is only the gentlest pulse of orange, a slow breathing ember that asks nothing of you except that you lie still and let the warmth find you where you are. We have traveled a long way together, you and I, through the lamplit corridors of a world that passed into dust 2,000 years ago, and yet somehow the dust itself feels familiar, feels close, feels like something you have always half remembered in the quietest rooms of sleep. And so before the last light goes, let us drift back through it all one more time, very slowly, very softly, the way a hand traces the outline of a map it knows by heart, not to learn it again, but simply to feel the shape of it beneath the fingertips. There were 7 hills once, and at dusk they held the heat of the day inside their stones, the way old walls always do, the terracotta and the marble, still faintly warm to the touch, even as the shadows lengthened, and the oil lamps in 1,000 windows began their small, quiet work against the dark. Into that world a child was born, into a family of ancient name and ancient pride, and the world around him was trembling at its foundations without anyone quite knowing what the trembling meant. The Republic was ending. It did not end loudly or all at once, but ended the way great things tend to end, gradually and then suddenly, like a fire that has been dying for hours before anyone notices the cold. The child was Tiberius, and he came into the world in the year that men would later count as 42 before the birth of Christ, born into a household that was already caught between the forces pulling Rome apart, a father whose loyalties would carry the family into danger, a mother whose intelligence and iron will would carry them back out again. Livia, even now, even whispering her name in the dark, there is something in it that commands a kind of attention. The boy was very small when the Rhodes began. It is said he was carried through the night along rough tracks between Naples and Sicily, his parents moving with the quiet urgency of people who know that safety is always somewhere just ahead, never quite where one is standing. Cold air, the smell of wood smoke from other people's fires, fires belonging to strangers who did not know or did not care who the fugitives were, the sound of horses on uncertain ground, and the child, very small, held close, absorbing through his skin the texture of a world that was always asking more than it gave. Then the world changed again, as worlds do, and the family was brought in from the cold. Octavian, who would become Augustus, married Livia, and the boy Tiberius found himself inside the most powerful household in the Roman world, watching, learning, moving through those marble rooms with the particular careful attention of a child who understands that he is being watched in return. He stood at his stepfather's side at the games. He learned the correct words, the correct gestures, the correct silences. He grew. The army took him next, the way the army took most Roman boys of his class, and turned them into something harder and more useful. He rode east to Armenia, rode west to the Rhine, walked the cold, dark earth of Pannonia, and felt beneath his boots the soil of a world that did not yet know itself to be Roman and was not entirely sure it wished to be. He was a good soldier, and then a good commander, and the men who followed him trusted him with the particular trust that soldiers reserve for leaders who do not waste them carelessly. He was not warm, but he was steady, and in the field, steadiness is a kind of warmth. Then came the years that were not kind. A marriage dissolved, not by his choosing, and the woman he had loved, the quiet and gentle Vipsania, walked out of his life at the order of a man he could not refuse. Julia came in her place, Augustus's daughter, bright and restless and unhappy in her own ways, and the household they made together was not a home, but a performance, 2 people going through the gestures of a life neither of them had chosen. The lamps in those rooms burned, but somehow gave no warmth. He left. The story goes that Rome was genuinely shocked when Tiberius announced his departure for Rhodes, as though the island at the edge of the Aegean were another world entirely, which in some ways it was. And perhaps that is the word for what Rhodes gave him, not happiness exactly, but space. The slow, unhurried space of afternoons in an olive grove, of mornings in a small library with a scroll open in the lap, of evenings on a hillside watching the light change over the sea. The Aegean in late afternoon is a color for which there is no adequate word, a blue that shifts toward violet, toward silver, toward something that is almost not a color at all, but simply a quality of the air. He walked there for nearly 7 years, this man who had been one of Rome's most celebrated commanders, and walked as though he had nowhere particular to be, which was, at last, the truth. Rome called him back. It always does in the end. Rome calls its people back, and there is no refusing it. He returned older, quieter, more weathered in the particular way that years of reflection weather a person, and he took up the work again, the campaigns, the administration, the patient accumulation of duty that had always been the shape of his life. When Augustus died, in the long summer heat near Nola, the weight of everything passed into Tiberius's hands, and he held it with both of them, carefully, without celebration, as though he knew precisely how heavy it was. The early years of his reign were quiet and competent, in the way that quiet competence rarely gets remembered. He wrote careful letters, he restrained extravagant spending, he told the Senate that they were its own masters, and meant it for a while, until meaning things became more complicated. The shadow that gathered around him was not entirely his own making, or perhaps it was. Perhaps Sejanus was always the shape that Tiberius's distrust of the world was eventually going to take, a man given too much trust, allowed too close, until the closeness became its own kind of danger. When that shadow was at last removed, on a single swift autumn day that left Rome breathless, the emperor who remained was not the emperor who had begun. He was older, more alone, more certain that the world could not be trusted, which made the world around him more afraid. Capri was the last chapter, and in some ways the most peaceful, if peace is understood as a kind of stillness, rather than a kind of happiness. The island above the Tyrrhenian Sea, with its terraced gardens, and its salt wind, and its limestone paths that wound between the villas toward the cliff edge, where the old man walked in the evenings and watched the water far below, catching the last of the light. He governed the empire by letter from that height, and the empire continued as empires do, largely by the accumulated weight of its own momentum. The letters went out, the answers came back. The sea moved below the cliffs in its own untroubled rhythm, neither knowing nor caring who was watching it from above. He died near Misenum, in the 37th year of the Common Era, in the late winter or early spring, the season when the light is returning but has not yet arrived, and the world is suspended between cold and warmth, in that particular way that feels like waiting. The story goes that he simply stopped. Stopped breathing, stopped watching, stopped holding the enormous weight of it all, and set it down at last. He was 77 years old. He had been alive for a long time. The 7 hills are still there, or the shapes of them are, under 2,000 years of new building and new living. And if you were to stand on one of them at dusk on a still evening, you might feel, without being able to explain it, the faint residual warmth of all the lives that have been lived on those slopes, all the oil lamps and hearth fires and braziers glowing behind old shuttered windows, the accumulated warmth of centuries resting in the stone. Tiberius walked those hills as a boy. He fled them in the night, and returned to them and fled again, and returned again. He sat somewhere on those slopes in lamplight, and read his Greek philosophers, and was unhappy in the particular private way that intelligent people with too much power and not enough love tend to be unhappy. He was complicated, and difficult, and weary, and human, and now he is dust, and the hills hold his dust the way they hold everyone's, without preference, without judgment, simply holding it in the warm ancient stone, and now it is time for you to rest, truly rest, letting all of it drift, the roads and the seas and the soldiers and the lamplight and the slow turning of the Aegean in the afternoon, letting it all dissolve into the quiet dark behind your eyes, where all stories eventually go. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are listening from tonight. The fire is only embers now, and the hills are still, and there is nothing left to do but close your eyes and let the dark be gentle.